Chapter 39. Sebastian returned to Brook Street to find Sir Henry Lovejoy on the verge of descending the house's front steps. "Sir Henry," said Sebastian, handing Tom the reins and hopping down from the curricle's high seat, "I'm glad I caught you. Please, come in." He led the way to the drawing-room, ordered tea for Lovejoy, poured himself a brandy, and told the magistrate the results of his trip to Windsor. "Merciful heavens," said the magistrate, after listening to the circumstances surrounding Toop's death. "You don't think it possible the verger simply slipped into the river and drowned?" "It would be a startling coincidence if he did, but we'll know more once Gibson gets a look at him." Lovejoy sipped his tea for a moment in thoughtful silence. "If it was murder, then why didn't the killer cut off Toops's head as he did with the others?" "That I can't answer." Sebastian cradled his brandy in one palm and went to stand before the fire. "Were you coming to see me for a particular reason?" "I was, yes. It may be unimportant, but you'll recall that Stanley Preston went off somewhere in a hackney the day he was killed. Well, we've finally located the Jarvey involved." "And?" "The Jarvey remembers the affair quite clearly, for he found it rather peculiar." Lovejoy set aside his teacup and leaned forward. "Preston asked to be put down at the entrance to Bucket Lane on Fish Street Hill." "Good God! Whatever for?" A thoroughfare linking London Bridge to Gracechurch Street and Bishopsgate, Fish Street Hill was the centre of a poor, overcrowded area, inhabited mainly by those connected in some way with the fish market of Billingsgate, which lay just to the west of the bridgehead. Sebastian could think of nothing that might have taken Preston to the area. "That we've yet to ascertain," said Lovejoy. "Miss Preston says she has no notion what her father could have been doing there." "You believe her?" Lovejoy looked at him in surprise. "You don't? I think Miss Anne Preston is being less than honest with us about a number of things." "Oh dear, I hadn't realized that." The magistrate looked thoughtful for a moment. "What?" said Sebastian, watching him. "Only that the constable who questioned Preston's servants reported the staff were not as forthcoming as they might have been. You think they could be protecting Miss Preston for some reason?" "It's possible. You might have one of your lads take another go at them." Lovejoy nodded. "I'll have Constable Hart talk to them again. I sent him out to Bucket Lane, by the way. Unfortunately, he was unable to locate anyone who would admit to knowing Preston or even remembered seeing him." "I'm not surprised." People who lived in places such as Fish Street Hill weren't exactly known for their friendliness to constables. "Your constable was lucky to get out of there alive." "That's what he said, and he's refusing to go back again." Sebastian was rubbing a nasty mixture of bacon grease and ashes into his hair when Hero came to stand at the entrance to his dressing-room. "7 Dials?" she asked, watching him. "Or Stepney Green?" "Billingsgate." "Really? Whatever for?" He told her. She said, "Why Billingsgate? It makes no sense." "I know." He paused to slip his small double-barreled pistol into the pocket of one of his most old-fashioned and ill-fitting Rosemary Lane coats. "That's what makes it so intriguing." Chapter 40. A pungent, seaweed-like odour permeated the air around London Bridge, taking on the more distinct smell of fish the closer Sebastian came to the bridge and its adjacent fish market. For as long as anyone could remember, the bridgehead had been dominated by the fishmongers of Billingsgate. This was an area of brawny women in aprons shiny with fish scales, of men in slime-stiffened canvas trousers, or the red worsted caps of sailors. The tangled rigging of oyster boats showed in the breaks between the tightly packed buildings, and seagulls wheeled overhead, their plaintive cries mingling with the shouts of "Place alive, alive cheap," and "Mussels a penny a quart." The stretch of the bridge approach, known as Fish Street Hill, was crowded with shops selling everything from cod and periwinkles to stores of wine, pitch, and tar. But in the warren of narrow lanes and mean courts to the west lived the fishmongers themselves, along with the costers who bought the fish of Billingsgate to sell on the streets of London. Sebastian arrived by hackney, slipping easily into the persona he had chosen to adopt. Silas Nelson, a somewhat mentally deficient bumpkin from a small village in Kent. By the time he paid off his hackney at the entrance to the narrow passageway leading to Bucket Lane, all traces of the self-confident Viscount had vanished. His shoulders slumped, and he walked with his head thrust forward, his gaze flitting nervously from side to side, a foolish half-grin plastered on his slack features. It was a trick his former lover, Cat Boleyn, had taught him long ago when she was first making her mark on the stage, and he was an idealistic youth just down from Oxford. "It's not enough simply to dress the part of a character," she told him. "You need to let their personality infuse every fibre of your being, the way you walk and talk, your attitude toward yourself and others, even life itself." The lesson had served him well during the war, when he'd operated as an exploring officer in the mountains of Italy and the peninsula. But he slammed his mind shut against those memories. Now, shuffling along with an awkward gait, he cut through the passage to find himself in a dim lane of bleak, dilapidated houses that seemed almost to touch overhead, shutting out all sunlight. Tattered laundry hung from upper-story windows, while vacant-eyed children and half-starved, snarling dogs clustered in the narrow stretch of mud and steaming garbage that passed for a street. The air was thick with the smell of decay and excrement, and the inescapable, oppressive odour of fish. He knocked on the first door to his right and waited, still vaguely smiling. No one answered. Tipping back his head, he peered up at the cracked, grimy windows of the overhanging second story. He could feel the inhabitants inside, hear their soft whispers and furtive movements. But the door remained closed. He moved on to the next house and rapped loudly on the worn, weathered door. Silence. "Hey!" he hollered. "Anybody home?" Farther down the lane, a door opened, and an old man came out leaning on a cane, a cap pulled low over his ears, and a tattered scarf wrapped thick about his neck. "Excuse me," called Silas Nelson, hurrying toward him. "Can I talk to you?" The man glanced once at Sebastian, then turned to walk in the opposite direction, his cane gripped tightly in his fist. "Hey, I'm looking for Mr. Stanley Preston. You know him?" The man kept walking. Silas Nelson drew up, his shoulders slumping more than ever. "Why won't anybody talk to me?" he asked of the now empty street. Even the children had disappeared. "Who are you?" demanded a voice behind him. Sebastian spun around. A woman stood in the centre of the muddy, refuse-strewn lane, her arms crossed at her chest, her head thrown back as she stared at him with narrowed, startlingly turquoise eyes. She looked to be somewhere in her 30s, and was stunningly beautiful, with smooth café-au-lait skin and rich dark hair that peeked from beneath the red kerchief she wore around her head. She was built tall and slender, with a graceful long neck and high cheekbones and full lips. "You deaf or something?" she asked when he didn't answer. "I said, who are you?" "Silas Nelson, ma'am," said Sebastian, snatching off his moth-eaten cap and executing a jerky bow. The woman sniffed. "Never seen you before. What you doing here?" "Begging your pardon, ma'am, but I'm looking for Mr. Preston, Mr. Stanley Preston. Would you know him by chance?" "Ain't no one by that name lives round here." "I'm told he was here last Sunday." "Who told you that?" It had occurred to Sebastian that Lovejoy's constable had probably agitated the neighbourhood to the extent that any stranger suddenly appearing in their midst that day would be immediately suspect. So he twisted his cap in his hands and said, "Constable, ma'am. Well, I suppose I should say the innkeeper of the Red Fox. What had it from the constable? That's where I'm staying, you see, at the Red Fox on Fish Street Hill." When the innkeeper heard I'd come to town looking for Mr. Preston, he said, "That's right queer, for we had a constable here just this morning asking about him. Said he'd been in Bucket Lane." Sebastian's Silas Nelson leaned forward eagerly. "Have you seen him, then? Oh, please say you have." Her expression turned from one of suspicion to mild disgust. "Who are you?" "I'm Silas Nelson, ma'am." "You already told me that. What I mean is, where you come from? What do you want with Preston?" "I'm from Dymchurch, ma'am, down in Kent. I come up to London because my sister's been taking care of me. But she done gone and died, and now what am I to do? I remembered her husband had some dealings once with Mr. Preston, so I come to town hoping maybe he could find something for me to do. I hear he's powerful rich. Only I don't know his direction, and London is ever so big. I'd no notion, it's nothing like Dymchurch, you know. I was puzzling on how to even begin looking for him, when the innkeeper tells me about Bucket Lane." Sebastian gave a broad grin. "So, here I am." "You're an idiot." It was said more as a statement of fact than as an insult. Sebastian widened his grin. "Yes, ma'am." She pushed out her breath between her teeth and shook her head. "Your Mr. Preston don't live here. He lives in a grand house out Knightsbridge way. Or I suppose I should say he did. He's dead." "Dead?" Sebastian let his face fall ludicrously. "That's right." "But what am I to do?" "Go back to Kent," she suggested. "But you did know Mr. Preston, yes?" She didn't deny it, but simply stared at him, waiting for him to finish. He leaned forward. Maybe you know somebody could find me work. I may not be smart, but I am strong." "Sorta." "Sorry." She threw an expressive glance at the surrounding squalor. "Take a look around. People here have a hard enough time feeding themselves, let alone finding work for others. And you're wrong. I didn't know Preston." Her upper lip curled in disgust. "The only people like me that man ever knew was working in his sugar-cane fields and calling him Massa." Sebastian looked confused. "Ma'am?" "Never mind." She jerked her head toward the passage leading back to Fish Street Hill. "Just get out of here before something happens to you. This ain't no place for the likes of you." "Ma'am?" "You heard me. Take yourself off. Now." Sebastian pulled his cap down on his head with both hands and allowed his whole being to sag with dejection and despair as he turned back toward Fish Street Hill. He paused at the dark mouth of the passage to look back. She still stood in the middle of the muddy lane, her arms crossed at her chest, her gaze narrowed as she watched him. Although whether she watched to keep him from harm, or to make certain he actually did leave, he couldn't have said. Sebastian settled against the worn squabs of the hackney carrying him back to Brook Street, his gaze on the tumble-down buildings and ragged, desperate people that flashed past on the far side of the carriage window. The farther west they travelled, the finer the shops and houses became, the wider and better paved the streets, the better dressed and better fed the people, until it seemed to him that he might have entered a different land. Their society was one of infinitesimally exact gradations, with each individual acutely aware of his or her own place in relation to all others. Grand nobles, such as Sebastian's Aunt Henrietta, were casually contemptuous of mere landed gentry, such as Stanley Preston. Yet Preston had considered himself fully justified in despising and protecting his daughter from the likes of Captain Hugh Wyeth, who might be gently born, but was nevertheless woefully impoverished. Intelligence, moral fibre, education, talent, all counted for little without birth and wealth. What mattered in their world was a carefully calibrated interplay of those two vital attributes. It was a delicate equation that would no doubt baffle an outsider, but never those who lived within it, who grew up instinctively attuned to the implications of their subtlest gradations. And then there were those without either birth or land, those engaged in that shameful thing called trade. Make enough money, and a man could buy an estate, and in a few short generations convince his peers to forget his plebeian origins, his ties to that great horde who actually worked for a living. Yet even the common multitude had their own distinct gradations in rank. Merchants, craftsmen, innkeepers, labourers, costermongers, prostitutes, all knew their exact place in society and considered themselves superior to those ranked below them. Even the thieves had their elites and their dregs, with highwaymen looking down on the housebreakers, who in turn despised the mere cut-purses and pickpockets. By all reports, Stanley Preston had been both painfully aware and deeply resentful of what he saw as his own inadequate position in the grand scheme of things. Desperate to claw his way higher up the social ladder, he had married a lord's daughter, and fought hard to secure advantageous marriages for his children, all the while surrounding himself with artifacts of the great nobles and kings and queens of the past. And yet fewer than 12 hours before someone cut off his head and set it up on the parapet of Bloody Bridge, he'd travelled across London to a mean lane off Fish Street Hill to interact in some unknown way with a tall, dusky-skinned woman with turquoise eyes who despised him. Why? She was no simple prostitute, of that Sebastian was fairly certain. The neighbourhood was one favoured by costermongers who tended to cluster together close to the markets they visited at dawn to buy their stock. From her dress, Sebastian suspected the unknown woman of Bucket Lane was a coster herself, while her appearance and remarks suggested that at least one of her grandparents had been of African blood. Was that significant? Perhaps. A new theory was forming in his imagination. Outlandish, improbable even, and yet... What he needed, he realized, was to speak to someone who knew Preston well, really knew him. And that meant not his daughter Anne, but his long-time friend, Sir Galen Knightley. Chapter 41. Newly changed into doeskin breeches and a well-tailored dark blue coat with his hair still damp, Sebastian knocked on the door of Sir Galen Knightley's townhouse in Half Moon Street, to find the baronet standing in the stately old-fashioned hall with his gloves in one hand and a walking-stick tucked up under his arm. "I beg your pardon," said Sebastian. "Have I caught you on the verge of going out?" Sir Galen looked vaguely chagrined. "Well, actually, yes. Did you need something?" "I had a few more questions about Preston. I was hoping you might be able to answer." The baronet glanced at the hall clock. "Would you mind walking with me toward Bond Street?" It was Sir Galen's practice, Sebastian recalled, to dine at Stephen's every Wednesday and Sunday at 6:30. "Of course," said Sebastian, and the older man's face cleared. Sebastian let his gaze drift around the hall while Knightley conferred for a moment with his butler. From the looks of things, the house had been little altered since the days of Sir Galen's grandfather. The baronet's tragic young bride, who had survived her wedding by only 10 months before dying in childbirth, hadn't lived long enough to make many changes, and her grief-stricken widower had obviously been content to leave things as they were. "Have you made some progress in your investigations?" asked Sir Galen as they descended the front steps and turned toward the east. "Some. I was wondering if you know what might have taken Stanley Preston to Fish Street Hill last Sunday. To a wretched alley called Bucket Lane." "Fish Street Hill?" Knightley glanced over at him in surprise. "Good heavens, no. I can't imagine." "You're certain?" "Yes." "How very odd." Is it? Very. Stanley had what you might call an aversion to those of low birth. In general, he avoided them as much as possible. Low birth and low means? Well, yes, of course. Sebastian paused to hand a penny to the young crossing sweep who was busy clearing manure from the intersection with a ragged broom. It's been how long since Preston's wife died? 8 years, I believe. Why? He was still a fairly young man at the time of her death. Yet he never remarried? No, but then he was sincerely attached to his late wife. I honestly don't think he ever looked at another woman, before or after her death. He worshipped her. No mistresses? No, never. And if you're thinking that might be what took Stanley to this Bucket Lane, then I'm afraid you really don't understand the man who was Stanley Preston. If Stanley had been inclined to take a mistress, which he never did, of course, but if he had, he would never have chosen some common Billingsgate trollop. I remember hearing him say once that for a gentleman to lie down with a base-born wench was tantamount to miscegenation. Sebastian thought of the Bucket Lane woman's flawless dusky skin and exquisite bone structure, and wondered if Sir Galen actually knew his old friend as well as he thought he did. An interesting choice of words, said Sebastian. Miscegenation. Do I take it he never had any interest in the enslaved women who worked his plantations in Jamaica either? Good God, no. Yet it's not uncommon, is it? It is amongst gentlemen of honour. Sebastian watched a ponderous coal wagon making its way up the street and said nothing. Sir Galen cleared his throat. To my knowledge, Stanley Preston seldom ventured east of Bond Street except on business at the bank or exchange. I can't imagine what might have taken him to an area such as Fish Street Hill. Yet he did business with the likes of Pris Mulligan. Knightley's brows drew together in a puzzled frown. Who? Pris Mulligan, a decidedly unsavoury woman who keeps a second-hand shop in Houndsditch. Ah, yes. I remember hearing him speak of her, but then I suspect Stanley would have ventured into Hades and done business with Satan himself if the devil happened to possess something Stanley wanted for his collection. The baronet's eyes widened as if inspired by a sudden thought. Perhaps that's what he was doing in this Bucket Lane, buying some relic or another. The area's inhabitants are costers and fishmongers, not thieves and fencers. Some costers have been known to deal in stolen goods. Stolen hams and bolts of cloth, perhaps, not priceless relics. Perhaps one got lucky. Perhaps. Only how would he know to offer it to Preston? True. I hadn't thought of that. He shrugged. Then I'm afraid I have no explanation. He hesitated a moment, then said, Are you no closer to discovering who might have killed him? I'm afraid not. Knightley pushed out a long, pained sigh. And now Dr. Sterling is dead, too. It's beyond ghastly. You were acquainted with Sterling? Knightley shrugged. Jamaica is a very small island. Sebastian stared at him. Are you saying Douglas Sterling spent time in Jamaica? Yes. You didn't know? When? He practiced there as a young man, and he still goes out every few years to visit a daughter who married a merchant in Kingston. Knightley paused. Although I suppose I should say he used to go. That's a long voyage for a man of his age. It was, yes, but he always claimed the sea air was good for him, that it more than made up for the fatigue of the journey. Said it was the London fog that was going to kill him. Knightley shook his head sadly at the implication of his own words. When was Sterling last in Jamaica? Do you know? Recently, I believe, although I couldn't say precisely when. During Sinclair Oliphant's period as governor. It must have been, I suppose. Knightley drew up on the footpath before the Stevens. You think that's significant? It may be. I don't know. Knightley nodded, then glanced surreptitiously at his watch as a nearby clock tower chimed the quarter hour. Would you care to join me for dinner? Thank you, but I'm afraid I have a previous engagement. It was only partially a lie. Sebastian's engagement was with Sinclair Oliphant. The Colonel just didn't know about it yet. Dressed now in satin knee-breeches and an evening coat, with a chapeau bras and a silver-headed walking stick that concealed a sharp, deadly dagger, Sebastian trolled the pleasure grounds of London's Auton, the gentlemen's clubs and gaming rooms and glittering, elegant ballrooms that provided evening entertainment to the city's most bored, most pampered residents. He finally came upon his quarry at the highly fashionable ball being given by Lady Davenport. Lord Oliphant and his slim blonde wife were in her ladyship's supper-room, enjoying their hostess's lemon ices. Lady Oliphant was younger than her husband, probably no more than 25 or 30. One of 6 daughters of an impoverished squire, she was an attractive woman, although her face and nose were considered too long, her mouth too small and prim, her chin too pointed for her to have been acknowledged a beauty. When she first married Oliphant, he had been a mere army officer, destined for a life in that second tier reserved for younger sons. But the death of his childless elder brother had changed all that, bringing Oliphant a title, estate, wealth, and status. Watching her, Sebastian found himself wondering if she knew of the things her husband had done in the war before he'd become Lord Oliphant and Governor of Jamaica. Would she care if she did? For some reason he couldn't have explained, Sebastian found himself doubting it. He pushed away from the doorframe and walked toward them. He knew exactly when Oliphant became aware of his presence, knew it by the subtle shifting of the man's posture and the faint glitter that leapt into his eyes. But Oliphant continued eating his ice with an assumption of insouciance. Or perhaps it wasn't an assumption, Sebastian thought, watching him. In Sebastian's experience, men like Oliphant were made fundamentally different from their fellow beings. It was as if they'd been born immune, not only to empathy and compassion, but to worry and self-doubt and fear as well. "Again," said Oliphant when Sebastian drew up, the groaning expanse of Lady Davenport's heavily laden supper-table between them. "Again." He tightened his grip on the head of his sword-stick. "I'm told you knew Dr. Douglas Sterling." "I did, yes." Oliphant's eyelids drooped slightly as he sucked on a spoonful of lemon ice. "As did any number of other people, I'm sure." "True. But that number narrows considerably when one eliminates those who did not also know Stanley Preston." Lady Oliphant paused with her spoon hovering above her lemon ice, her entire being stiff with outrage. "Surely you're not suggesting my husband has anything to do with these dreadful murders?" "Yes," said Sebastian. Her long, thin nose quivered with scorn. "The very idea is beyond preposterous. A lord of the realm." "Did your husband ever tell you about Santa Iria?" he asked, watching her closely. She gave him a blank look. "What?" "Santa Iria. It is, or perhaps I should say was, a convent in the mountains of Portugal. A place of refuge for simple, devout women and the war orphans they cared for." She looked uninterested. "And what has this to do with anything?" The abbess of Santa Iria was the daughter of a local grandee, a prominent landowner who was reluctant to be seen taking sides against the French, for fear his people would suffer reprisals should the British be defeated. "So your husband came up with a way to persuade him." She threw Oliphant an admiring smile. "Sinclair is very inventive." Oliphant bowed, but said nothing. "He is that," agreed Sebastian. He sent out a courier carrying false dispatches suggesting the abbess of Santa Iria was acting as a spy for the British. Then he tipped off a French troop in the area, so that they were able to capture the courier. Needless to say, the French believed the dispatches to be genuine. "That was clever," said Lady Oliphant. "The courier didn't think so." She shrugged. Oliphant sucked on another spoonful of ice. "Do finish your story. I suspect my wife will enjoy it." She looked at Sebastian expectantly. He said, The French attacked Santa Iria at dawn. The convent was burned, the women and children all killed. Not even the smallest of babes was spared. The abbess, who was no British spy, but an innocent nun, was repeatedly violated and tortured in an effort to make her talk. She died in agony. And her father, the dithering grandee, was he persuaded by this French outrage to finally turn against Napoleon? Actually, no. He was so horrified by what had been done that he suffered a seizure and died. Pity. Still, you must admit it was an ingenious plan. Dozens of innocent women and children died needlessly. Yes, the French have perpetrated many such outrages across Europe, which is why, with the grace of God, they will soon be defeated. A gleam of amusement shone in her husband's light blue eyes. Sebastian said, "I don't think God had anything to do with what happened at Santa Iria. The good Lord works in mysterious ways." Sebastian studied her smug, self-satisfied face. He'd often wondered what sort of woman could be content married to a man like Oliphant. Now he knew. Oliphant said, "One of these days, Devlin, you really must move beyond the events of that spring in Portugal. War is war. Dreadful things happen. But do you think a London ball is the proper place to be dredging up the gruesome details? When people are still dying here in London, yes. I take it you're referring to this tiresome matter of Preston and Sterling." Oliphant sighed and handed his empty ice cup to a hovering waiter. "Shall I give you a little hint?" "Yes, I do believe I shall." "Sinclair is always most generous," said Lady Oliphant. Oliphant gave a small bow. "You are aware, of course, of the star-crossed love affair between Miss Preston and a certain hussar captain." When Sebastian remained silent, Oliphant said, "Of course Preston and his son did an admirable job of hushing up the elopement 6 years ago. But somehow whispers always seem to get about. Have you noticed? I tend to blame the servants." Had Hugh Wyeth and Anne Preston attempted an elopement in the past? Sebastian wondered. If so, this was the first he'd heard of it. He kept his voice sounding bored. "This is your hint." "Oh, no, I assumed you already knew about the young captain. But are you aware, I wonder, that there are interesting links between the captain and Dr. Sterling?" Oliphant's face creased into an indulgent smile. "Do you know where Captain Wyeth's regiment was stationed before their transfer to Portugal?" He leaned forward and whispered loudly, "It was Jamaica." When Sebastian made no response, Oliphant's lips pursed into a simulated moo of concern. "I'm afraid your obsession with the past is not only unhealthy, but is also negatively impacting your goal of catching this killer." He raised one eyebrow in mocking inquiry. "At least, I assume that is your goal, is it not?" With a petulant frown, Lady Oliphant set aside her ice cup and shook out the skirts of her elegant satin ball gown. "Come away, Sinclair, do. I want to dance." Oliphant took her hand in his and rested it on the crook of his bent arm. "Of course, my dear." He nodded casually to Sebastian. "Devlin?" Sebastian watched them thread their way through the growing crowd of guests filtering into the supper-room from the ballroom above. He watched as Lady Oliphant, a smile now plastered on her face, curtsied low to a dowager duchess, while Oliphant laughed heartily at a few pleasantries exchanged with her son, a cabinet minister. The conviction that Oliphant was hiding something remained, but all the old doubts came crowding back as Sebastian acknowledged the possibility that maybe, just maybe, he was allowing the events of the past to colour his interpretation of the present. And because of it, men were still dying. Chapter 42. Captain Hugh Wyeth was throwing darts by himself in the Shepherd's Rest public room, pitching one after the other at a battered board hanging against a pock-marked wall. He hardly seemed to be focusing, or even looking, and yet his aim was true every time. "You're good," said Sebastian, coming to lean against a nearby wall. "I've had a lot of practice lately. There's not much else to do." "When do you rejoin your regiment?" Wyeth let fly another dart. "According to the doctors, not as soon as I had hoped." "Who were you with?" "The 20th Hussars." "The 20th Hussars used to be stationed in Jamaica." Wyeth looked over at him, puzzled. "We were, yes." "Why? Did you ever meet Dr. Sterling there?" "Not to my knowledge." "Was he in Jamaica?" "As it happens, yes." The captain sent his last dart flying at the target. "You look like you're dressed for a ball." "I am." Wyeth grunted and went to retrieve his tightly clustered darts. He no longer wore his sling, but Sebastian noticed he held his right arm stiffly against his side. Sebastian said, "You told me you didn't know Sinclair Oliphant, yet he seems to know you." Wyeth looked around in surprise. "What? He's the one who told me you were stationed in Jamaica, presumably to shift suspicion away from himself and onto you. Did it work?" When Sebastian returned no answer, the captain gave a soft, humourless laugh and said, "I suppose the fact that you're here tells me all I need to know." He walked back to the throwing line, then paused, weighing his first dart. "Why would I kill some old doctor? Tell me that." "I don't know. But then I can't figure out why anyone would want to murder him. Unless it was because he knew something worrisome about whoever killed Stanley Preston." Wyeth threw his dart and practically missed the target entirely. Sebastian said, "Ever hear of a man named Rowan Toop?" "No." "Why, is he dead too?" Sebastian nodded. "They found him this morning at Windsor." "Someone cut off his head?" "No, actually he drowned." "You think I did that?" "You wouldn't happen to know what might have taken Stanley Preston to Bucket Lane last Sunday, would you?" "Where?" "Bucket Lane, off Fish Street Hill near London Bridge." "No." "Don't tell me someone's died there too." "Not to my knowledge." Wyeth threw the rest of his darts at the target, one after the other in rapid succession. This time they were spread all over the round wooden board in a chaotic pattern. Sebastian said, "Last Sunday at Lady Farningham's musical evening, you and Miss Preston quarrelled. That's why you left early, isn't it? In fact, Miss Preston herself left not long after you did." "So?" "Why did you quarrel?" "Does it matter?" "You tell me. Does it?" The captain twitched one shoulder and said nothing. Sebastian studied the younger man's angry, tightly held features. "Sinclair Oliphant told me something else. He says that 6 years ago you tried to elope with Miss Preston. Only her father and brother caught up with you and brought her back." Sebastian watched the blood drain from the captain's face. How the devil did he know that? Stanley Preston made himself Oliphant's enemy, and Oliphant is the kind of man who makes it his business to know his enemy's most dangerous secrets. So it's true. Wyeth swallowed hard. "Yes. Look, I'm not proud of what we did, but we were both very young and desperate, and we didn't understand the gravity of what we were doing." "It certainly does much to explain Preston's animosity toward you." Wyeth tightened his jaw and said nothing. "Miss Preston is of age now, yet most women are reluctant to marry without their father's blessing." "Particularly when there's a potential inheritance involved," Sebastian thought. "Would she have married you, do you think, if her father continued to withhold his consent?" "Stanley Preston was never going to change his mind, believe me." "So would she have married you anyway?" Wyeth swung to face him, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "You think I would have done that to her? Married her without his blessing? Preston would never have forgiven her. He swore he'd cut her off without a penny and never speak to her again. And he meant it. Yet you think I would have married her anyway? Taken her away from a life of comfort to make her follow the drum and live in poverty? My God, what kind of man do you take me for? You were certainly ready to elope with her 6 years ago. I was 18, I told you. I'm not proud of what happened 6 years ago, but I know better now. She wouldn't have been completely penniless, said Sebastian. She'd still have had her mother's portion. Her mother's portion amounts to even less than my annual pay. Enough to help buy a few promotions, perhaps, and ease the worst hardships that come with life in the army. But without her inheritance from Preston, I could never have given her anything like the kind of life she's always known. Is that so important? You know it is. I've seen what poverty can do to a gently reared woman. My grandfather was never as wealthy as Preston, but my mother still grew up surrounded by servants, with a carriage and her own pony, and summers spent at the seaside. With 5 daughters and an estate entailed to the male line, my grandfather couldn't give her much of a dowry, but she was pretty enough that he hoped she'd attract suitors anyway. And she did, the grandest being a man worth £10,000 a year. She turned them all down to marry your father? Wyeth nodded. My father's living was worth barely £200 a year. He gave a ragged laugh. Once she'd worn ball gowns worth nearly that much. Were they happy? They were happy with each other, yes. But her life was hard. She'd cry sometimes when she didn't know I could hear her. She worried constantly about where they were going to find the money to fix the vicarage roof, or pay my school fees, or provide for my 3 sisters. All that worry and fear. In the end, it killed her. That's when I realized how selfish I'd been, asking Anne to marry me, expecting her to endure a different version of the kind of life that killed my mother. You're saying that when faced with a choice between love and wealth, a woman should choose wealth? No, but you think your mother would have been happier married to a man with £10,000 a year whom she didn't love? No, but, and if your father had made the choice for her by walking away, would she have been happy? Wyeth glared at him. God damn you! Who are you, an earl's son, heir to a grand fortune, to presume to pass judgment on me? What do you know of the kind of choices the rest of us must make? More than you might think, said Sebastian. He was turning away when Wyeth's fist caught him high on the side of his cheek. You let him hit you, said Hero, holding a twisted cloth filled with ice against the rapidly purpling bruise. Not exactly, said Sebastian, wincing, but I did provoke him. It didn't seem right to hit him back. You're going to end up with a black eye. It won't be the first. She made an incoherent noise deep in her throat and went to refill her cloth from the bucket of ice provided by Calhoun. If he were clever, Captain Wyeth would be trying to convince you that Preston had agreed to let him marry Anne. Instead, he insists Preston would never have consented, then goes on to detail why a man of honour would never marry Anne without her inheritance. It's as if he were determined to tie a noose around his own neck and hang himself. I know. Which, ironically enough, makes me think he probably didn't kill Stanley Preston. Sebastian went to peer at his discoloured face in the washstand mirror. I wish I could say I felt the same way about Miss Anne Preston. Hero turned to look at him, the ice-filled cloth held slack in her hand. You can't be serious. Oh, I don't mean that she personally stabbed Preston and Sterling and cut off their heads. But she wouldn't be the first woman to hire someone to do her dirty work for her. Someone such as, say, Diggory Flynn. Surely she can't be that diabolical? To kill her own father? Sebastian shrugged. Patricide, matricide, fratricide. They seem so unnatural that we're repelled by the very thought. Yet they happen, Often enough that we've even coined words for them. Anne Preston wanted Captain Hugh Wyeth, but she knew he'd never marry her without her inheritance. Not because he's a greedy fortune hunter, but because he saw what poverty did to his mother, and he's too noble to do that to a woman he loves. So she removed Stanley Preston, and now she's free to marry her captain and receive her inheritance? Is that what you're suggesting? His noble qualms are stilled, and she never needs to worry about having to wash her own clothes in a muddy stream in some backward part of the world? Yes, it makes sense, if she's that shockingly selfish and cold-hearted. But it doesn't give her a reason to kill Douglas Sterling. Just because we don't know of a reason doesn't mean one doesn't exist. Hero set aside the ice-filled cloth. Why order the killer to cut off his victims' heads? Perhaps that was his own embellishment. Or perhaps she thought a more gruesome killing would help deflect suspicion from her. Surely she can't be that evil. I wouldn't have said so. But I've been wrong about people before. He took the ice-filled cloth and carefully pressed it against his face. The problem is, it still doesn't explain why Stanley Preston made a most uncharacteristic visit to Bucket Lane just hours before he was killed. That could be entirely unrelated to anything. It could be, said Sebastian, remembering the dusky-skinned woman with the long neck and the strange turquoise eyes. But I doubt it. And if it is related, then whoever Preston went to see that day might very well be in danger, although they probably don't know it. Hero went to hunker down beside the black cat curled up before the dressing-room fire. One of the costermongers I interviewed lives near Fish Street Hill, she said, her hand trailing down the cat's back. I could ask him to look into it. They all seem to know each other. She shifted her hand to scratch behind the cat's ears. And Rowan Toop. How do you think he fits into all this? I think he stole the royal relics from the crypt and was selling them to Preston. They'd arranged to meet at Bloody Bridge, except by the time Toop arrived, Preston was already dead. Toop was probably so horrified by what he discovered that he ran off, dropping the inscribed coffin strap in the process. It's hard to say whether or not he saw or knew something that could have identified the killer, but the killer obviously thought he did, and killed him too. Hero kept her gaze on the cat. Or Toop could have been so rattled by recent events that he simply slipped in the mud while taking his dog for a walk, and pitched into the Thames, without anyone's help. True. Sebastian set aside the melting ice and reached for a clean cloth to dry his face. I'm hoping Gibson will have an answer when I see him tomorrow. If he's not lost in an opium-induced fog, thought Sebastian. Chapter 43. Monday, 29th of March. After some 36 hours, Rowan Toop's corpse had taken on the vague odour of rotting fish. Naked and eviscerated, it lay on the stone table in the outbuilding at the base of Paul Gibson's unkempt yard. The Irishman was there, cold, sober, and cranky. He was not singing. I was wondering when you'd show up, he said, when Sebastian came to stand in the doorway. Good morning, said Sebastian. The surgeon grunted. Nice black eye. Thank you. Sebastian took one look at what was left of Toop, then looked elsewhere. So did he drown, or was he murdered? Maybe both. Maybe one, maybe the other. It's hard to say. It is. It is. Gibson set aside his knife with a clatter and reached for a rag to wipe the gore from his hands. He could have been hit over the head, then thrown into the river, whereupon he drowned. Or he could have fallen and hit his own head, slipped into the river, and drowned. He could even have slipped into the river, hit his head on something, and then drowned. But you're saying he was alive when he went into the water? Not necessarily. He could also have been hit on the head, died, and then been tossed into the river. That's a nasty blow he's got there, nasty enough to kill him without any help from the river. Was there water in his lungs? There was. Water, sand, even a few bits of grass. So he must have breathed all that stuff in, right? No. If there hadn't been any water in his lungs, then I could tell you, yes, he was probably dead when he hit the water. But the action of the river could have driven the water into his lungs even after he was dead. Gibson picked up his knife and pointed at what Sebastian realized must be Rowan Toop's lungs, sitting on a rusty tray parked on a nearby shelf. See that white foam? Yes, said Sebastian, who had no desire to peer too closely. You often find a fine white froth like that in the lungs of drownings pulled from the Thames. But you also see it in the lungs of men whose hearts have failed, or who have hit their heads. Now, your Rowan Toop's heart was just fine, but you obviously can't say the same thing about his head. Sebastian blew out a long, frustrated breath. So you can't tell me anything? No. Only thing remotely queer about any of this is that they found him so fast. A freshly dead body'll usually sink like a rock. They don't typically come up again until enough gas builds in their guts to float them to the surface. On this time of year, that usually takes about 5 days. 5 days? So why was Toop found on Romney Island less than 12 hours after he disappeared? Gibson shrugged. Must have been something about the way he went into the water. Trapped air in his cassock. It happens. He floated down to the island and got caught in the trees before he had a chance to sink. Sebastian braced his hands against the stone table and stared at the dead man's pale, bony face. I can't believe he just slipped and hit his head. Somebody killed him. Probably, agreed Gibson, but unless they find a bloody cudgel by the side of the river, you'll never be able to prove it. Later that morning, Sebastian joined Sir Henry Lovejoy at a coffee-house just off the Strand. I've had the lads looking into this Diggory Flynn you were asking about, said Lovejoy, taking a cautious sip of his hot chocolate. Unfortunately, they haven't been able to find a trace of him. It could be an assumed name. Sebastian wrapped his hands around his own steaming coffee. I've just come from Gibson's surgery. And? He says Toop's post-mortem is inconclusive. The verger may have been killed, or he may simply have slipped and fallen in the river. Lovejoy looked thoughtfully at Sebastian's discoloured eye, but all he said was, Perhaps that explains why Toop's head wasn't cut off, because he wasn't actually murdered. He was murdered, said Sebastian. Then how do you explain the differences in both the method of murder and the treatment of the body? It could be because the killer didn't have time to be more grisly, or perhaps he didn't want us to realize that Toop's death was connected to those of Preston and Stirling, or, prompted Lovejoy. Sebastian rested his elbows on the table. Ask yourself, why would a killer cut off his victims' heads? Because he's mad. That's one explanation, but there are others. The killer's purpose could be to create fear, either in the community at large, or in one specifically targeted individual who knows he's next. Such as whom? Sebastian shook his head. I don't know. From the distance came the rat-a-tat-tat of a military drum and the tramp of marching feet. Either way, said Lovejoy, it's still the work of a madman. No sane individual goes around cutting off people's heads. I think most of us are a bit mad, each in our own way. But to cut off a man's head— Sebastian stared out the bowed window at a street filled with stout matrons and city merchants and all the usual bustle of a London morning. But he wasn't seeing any of it. He was seeing another time, another place. It happens in battle, he said, more often than you might think. It's as if the act of killing taps into something primitive within us, a deep and powerful rage that finds expression in the mutilation of a dead enemy. You think that's what we're dealing with here? Rage? But over what? I still don't know, but I suspect that rage was directed at Preston and Sterling, whereas Toop was killed simply out of concern he might have seen something. What a disturbing thought. Lovejoy sat for a moment in silence. Then he cleared his throat and said, I've had some of the lads interviewing the regular patrons at the Monster, as you suggested. They located a solicitor who was seated at a table near Henry Austin when Preston came into the tavern last Sunday night. He says the way Preston was yelling made it virtually impossible not to hear everything that was said. And? It seems that, amongst other threats, Preston swore he was going to withdraw his funds from Austin's bank. Did Preston bank with Austin? He did. Indeed, his deposits were quite substantial. And here's another interesting thing. Dr. Douglas Sterling was also a subscriber. What does Henry Austin say about all this? He claims his bank is strong enough to withstand the defection of a dozen such subscribers. Is it? Who can say? But this doesn't look good for him. It doesn't look good at all. Sebastian found Henry Austin coming out of a small brick chapel tucked away off Brompton Row. This was a part of Handstown, as yet unspoiled by London's creeping sprawl, where budding chestnut trees swayed gently in the breeze, and vast fields of market gardens stretched away to the east. The day had dawned gloriously warm, with the sky a rare, clear blue, and the air fresh with the promise of spring. Sebastian paused his curricle across from the chapel, the brim of his hat tipped against the strengthening sun, and watched Henry Austin walk out the chapel door, eyes blinking against the sudden fierceness of the light. His gaze focused on Sebastian, and he momentarily froze before turning to speak to the two women who accompanied him, his sister Jane, and their friend, Miss Anne Preston. Jane Austen looked up, smiled, and nodded to Sebastian. Anne Preston stared at him, but she did not smile or acknowledge him in any way. "That younger gentry, Mort, don't appear to like you overly much," observed Tom from his perch at the rear of the curricle. "She doesn't, does she?" agreed Sebastian. Leaving the two women to walk on alone, Henry Austen crossed the street toward Sebastian, then drew up while still some feet away. "How did you find me?" "Your clerk told me you were helping Miss Preston finalize the details of her father's funeral." Austen nodded, his arms hanging loosely at his sides. "I know why you're here." "I figured you would. Climb up. Tom will get down and wait for us." Austen hesitated for a moment, then leapt into the high seat as Tom scrambled down. "I won't be long," Sebastian told the tiger, and gave his horses the office to start. "Fine pair," said Austen, his gaze on the chestnuts' sun-warmed hides as they bowled up the lane toward Fulham. "They were bred on my estate down in Hampshire." Austen turned his head to look at Sebastian. "I take it you find my failure to tell you of Preston's threat to my bank suspicious?" "Should I?" "Bow Street does. Perhaps that's because they don't understand the important part that confidence plays in the stability of a bank. I'm not surprised you chose to keep it quiet. Or as quiet as you could, after Preston shouted his intentions in a crowded tavern." When Austen remained silent, Sebastian said, "Could your bank have withstood Preston's withdrawal? And before you answer, I should warn you that I have the resources to verify your answer." "Then why bother to ask?" snapped the banker. Sebastian kept his attention on the road. After a moment, Austen said, "Yes, the bank is solid, damn you. Preston was a large investor, I won't deny that, but not by any means the largest." "Do you think he would have carried through on his threat?" "Honestly, I don't know. He was always flying off the handle and saying wild things, only to later calm down and reconsider." "And Douglas Sterling, would he have followed his old friend's lead and also removed his funds from your bank?" Austen looked genuinely surprised. Sterling? Of course not. Why would he? Because of the friendship between them. Austin shook his head. They knew each other, of course, had known each other for years. But I'd characterize them more as acquaintances than what you might call friends. Apart from the difference in their ages, Sterling was a physician from a relatively humble background, whereas Preston had grand ambitions of taking his place in society. He was always talking about his late wife, the Baron's daughter, or his cousin, the Home Secretary. Another man might have ignored the disparity in their rank and wealth, but not Preston. Was Preston ill, do you think? Sebastian asked, guiding his horses around an empty farm wagon. Not to my knowledge. But then, as I said, Preston and I weren't exactly great friends either. From the sound of things, he wasn't intimate with many people. In my experience, people who view others as social or financial assets rarely do accumulate close friends. True, said Sebastian. You wouldn't by chance happen to know what took Preston to Fish Street Hill last Sunday, would you? Fish Street Hill? Good heavens, no. Ever known Preston to keep a mistress? Austin's eyes widened at the question. No, he was genuinely madly in love with his wife, and never got over her death. What about when he was a very young man, say 30 or 35 years ago, when he was in Jamaica? Rather than answer immediately, Austin studied Sebastian from beneath half-lowered lids. What are you suggesting? Any possibility Preston could have had a child by one of the slave women on his plantations? You can't be serious. Is it so improbable? Let's just say that if you'd known Preston, you'd understand just how improbable it is. His belief in the superiority of the English was intense and unshakable. I mean, the man could never forgive my wife for once having married a Frenchman. And while I wasn't acquainted with him 30 years ago, the mind frankly boggles at the thought of him raping one of his slave women, if that's what you're suggesting. Those who rail the loudest against racial impurity are often those who feel they have something to hide, something that violates their own twisted moral code. Austin thought about it a moment, then blew out a long breath. I suppose it's possible, but whatever gave you such an idea? I have a very active imagination. Austin gave a startled laugh. You must. I'm not convinced even my sister Jane could have come up with that one. The banker stared off across a sunlit pasture dotted with grazing brown cows. His eyes narrowed as if he was struggling to come to some sort of decision. Then he said, Jane told me something the other day that might interest you, by the way. Oh, what's that? You know that fellow who keeps a curiosity shop in Chelsea? Basil Thistlewood. That's him. Well, it seems that when she arrived at Alford House to take Anne up in my carriage, Preston and Thistlewood were standing in the middle of the street shouting at each other. She didn't think too much of it at the time. Preston was always squabbling with someone, you know. But while she has no desire to say something that might throw suspicion on an innocent man, she's begun to wonder if perhaps you shouldn't know about it. This happened last Sunday evening. Yes, around 9, said Austin. That surprises you. Why? Sebastian swung his horses in a wide loop at the crossroads and headed back toward Brompton Row. Because Thistlewood claims he never left his coffee house that day at all. Chapter 44. Basil Thistlewood was standing beneath the elms lining the Thames at Cheyne Walk, and throwing chunks of bread to a gathering of some 6 ducks when Sebastian walked up to him. The spring sunlight glimmered on the wide stretch of river beside them, and the limbs of the budding trees overhead throbbed with birdsong. The curiosity collector cast a quick sideways glance at Sebastian, then went back to pitching bread. "Didn't expect to see you again." "You should have," said Sebastian, watching the ducks dart after the bread, their feathers iridescent in the sunlight. When you stand in the middle of the street shouting at someone who turns up dead later that very evening, you have to expect that sooner or later someone is going to remember it. How'd you hear about that? Does it matter? Suppose not. Thistlewood tore off another chunk of bread and pitched it at the ducks. Care to tell me about it? Thistlewood twitched one shoulder. Not much to tell. Friend of mine's got a shop in Knightsbridge. I was walking back from visiting him and just minding my own business when Preston comes barging out of his house and chases after me, accusing me of all sorts of outlandish stuff. What sort of outlandish stuff? Watching his house. Were you watching his house? Well, I may have stopped and looked at it, but I weren't watching it. I was coming back from having a game of chess with Rory. You can check, he'll tell you. Rory Lamar lives over his tobacco shop in Knightsbridge. You ask him, and he'll tell you I was there. You told me you never left your coffee shop that Sunday. Thistlewood sniffed. What do you think, that I'm going to step forward and volunteer the information that Preston and me had words an hour or two before he got himself killed? It does rather make it look as if you have something to hide. Just 'cause I hid the fact I saw him that day don't mean I killed him. Some might interpret it that way. The curiosity collector pressed his lips together and thrust them out in a way that made him look somewhat like a disgruntled turtle. Sebastian said, It was Rowan Toop who showed you the lead-wrapped bodies of the woman and child you told me about, wasn't it? Thistlewood's eyes widened. I read about what happened to him in the papers. What are you saying? That I maybe killed him too? I didn't. But you did know him. I knew him. Never bought nothing from him, though. I told you before, I can't afford to pay for the things I put on display. And Toop wanted to be paid. He did indeed. Did Toop ever sell items to Stanley Preston? I can't say for certain, but I expect so. The curiosity collector shot Sebastian another one of his sideways glances. You think whoever lopped off Preston's head also done for Toop? I think it more than likely. Well, all I know is it weren't me. Ask anyone, they'll tell you. I'm not a violent man. Despite your fascination with swords and headsmen's axes and executioner's blocks. You don't find 'em fascinating? In a macabre sort of way, I suppose I do. But they also repel me. Thistlewood tore off another piece of bread and chucked it at the ducks. I reckon we're all afraid of death. We know we're going to die, but none of us wants to. He gave a strange, watery chuckle. Some folks, they've got this notion that if they think about death, they're inviting it closer. So they don't want to be reminded of it in any way. But then there's others who think that by getting close to death, by staring it in the face, so to speak, we make it less scary. I take it you fall into the latter category. Thistlewood gave another of his odd chuckles. Reckon I do. And you too? Me? Why else would you do what you do? Look for murderers, I mean. Sebastian started to deny it. If asked, he'd have said his dedication to finding a measure of justice for the victims of murder had far more to do with guilt and a need for redemption than with a fear of death. And yet... He watched as the curiosity collector crumpled the last of his bread and scattered it in the water. The branches of the elms overhead cast shifting patterns of light and shade across the waves washing gently against the river bank. The air smelled of damp earth and the wild mint that grew in the hollows between the gnarled roots. He listened to the splash of a wherryman's oars farther out on the Thames, heard the squeals and laughter of children playing in a nearby pasture. And he was forced to acknowledge that, in a sense, Thistlewood was right. Except it wasn't his own death Sebastian feared, but the death of those he loved, lest they be forced to pay with their own lives for the lives of the women and children he'd failed to save. "Have you ever killed anyone?" Thistlewood asked suddenly. "Surely you have." You been in the army and all? Why do you ask? I attend the hangings at Newgate sometimes. I watch the hangman pull that lever and I think, what must it feel like to kill someone? To know that 1 minute they're living and the next they're not, and it's you who's done that. He looked at Sebastian expectantly, his lips pulled back in a hopeful, almost eager half-smile. But Sebastian only shook his head, unwilling to satisfy the man's ghoulish curiosity. Until that moment, Sebastian would have said he doubted that Thistlewood had anything to do with the recent string of murders. Despite Thistlewood's lies, despite the public arguments and intense professional and personal jealousy, Sebastian had largely discounted him as a suspect, instead becoming more and more convinced that the grisly killings were the work of someone hired by Sinclair Oliphant, or Pris Mulligan, or perhaps even by Preston's own daughter Anne. Now he wasn't so sure. Micah MacDougall leaned against his donkey cart, his beefy arms crossed at his chest, first one cheek, then the other puffing out with air as he stared thoughtfully at Hero. "Stanley Preston, ain't he the cove that got his head cut off at Bloody Bridge?" Hero nodded. "He visited Bucket Lane just hours before he was killed. I'm trying to find out why he went there and whom he saw." MacDougall squinted up at the thick grey clouds scuttling in overhead to rob the day of its promise of warmth and sunshine. A cold wind had kicked up, ruffling the feathers of the gulls screaming overhead, and intensifying the odour of raw fish that rose from both the man and his cart. "You thinking maybe some coster done for him?" "No, not at all. But 2 other people who knew Preston and saw him that day are now dead too, which means that whoever Preston visited in Bucket Lane could very well be in danger. Only he or she might not know it." MacDougall brought his gaze back to her face. "Well, I can look into it, my lady, but I can't guarantee they'll be willing to talk to you." "I know. Just whoever it is, please try to help them understand that their lives might be threatened. If they know anything at all, it's important for them to come forward." He rasped one palm across the several days' worth of beard shading his jaw. "I'll try, my lady. I'll try." The rain was already beginning to fall by the time Hero made it back to Brook Street. A fine but hard-driven rain that swirled in wind-whipped eddies between the tall townhouses and stung the tender bare skin of her face. She had just stepped from her carriage and was about to mount the front steps when she saw Devlin round the corner from Bond Street, the capes of his black greatcoat flapping in the wind, his hat tipped low against the downpour. "Devlin," she called, and he looked up, his face lean and unsmiling. Then his strange yellow eyes widened, his body jerking as the crack of a rifle shot reverberated between the tall row houses. A shiny wet stain bloomed dark against the darkness of his coat. "No!" Hero screamed. The bullet's impact spun him around. He grasped the iron railing of a nearby house's area steps, tried to stay upright, crumpled slowly to his knees. "Oh, my God!" Hero ran, hands fisted in her skirts. Her world narrowed down to a grey, wet canyon where the only sound was a desperate gasping she dimly recognized as her own, and the only colour, the red splash of Devlin's blood. "Sebastian!" She dropped to her knees beside him, hands reaching for him. He lay curled on his side, away from her, the rain washing over his pale face. She touched his shoulder, and he turned toward her. She saw the confusion in those familiar yellow eyes, the pain that convulsed the features that were so like Devlin's. But it wasn't Devlin. It was Jamie Knox. Chapter 45. Sebastian reached home just as Pippa, the barmaid from the Black Devil, was coming down the front steps. She had a paisley shawl drawn up over her head, and a child of perhaps a year on her hip. At the sight of Sebastian she paused, her arms tightening around the child so that he squirmed in protest. "It's your fault," she screamed, tears mingling with the rain on her face. "I told him no good would come of it, but would he listen to me? No, he never listened to me." Sebastian stared at the child in her arms. It was a boy, with fine-boned features and a small turned-up nose, and the same yellow eyes that stared back at Sebastian from his own mirror. From his own infant son. "What are you talking about?" he said. Her laugh was raw, torn. Not really a laugh at all. "You saying you don't know? He's laying up there in one of your own fancy beds, dying because of you, and you don't know." He grabbed her arm more roughly than he'd intended. "Knox!" She jerked away from him. You tell him I won't stay and watch him die." And she pushed past him, her head bowed against the rain, her shoulders convulsing with her sobs as the boy gazed back at Sebastian with a solemn, intense stare. Gibson was coming out of the guest bedroom at the end of the hall when Sebastian reached the second floor. "How is he?" The surgeon rubbed his eyes with a spread thumb and forefinger. "I've done what I can. The bullet ripped through his lungs and lodged beside his heart. He's bleeding inside and there's no way to stop it. At this point, it's just a matter of time. Surely there's some hope, a chance?" Gibson shook his head. "Lady Devlin thinks whoever shot him mistook Knox for you." Sebastian felt an aching hollowness open up inside him, carved out by denial and rage and a hideous, familiar sense of guilt. "Where was he?" "Just steps from your front door." Gibson started to say something else, then stopped. "What?" asked Sebastian. "It's just... the resemblance is uncanny." "Yes," said Sebastian, and turned toward the bedroom. He found Knox lying with his eyes closed, so ashen and still that for a moment Sebastian thought him already dead. Then he saw the rifleman's bare, bandaged chest jerk, heard the laboured rasp of a dying man's breath. Hero sat nearby, her fingers laced together in her lap, her eyes sunken and stark, as if she'd just been given a glimpse into the yawning mouth of hell. "He was coming to see you," she said softly. "Do you know why?" She shook her head. He tried to say, but it didn't make any sense. And then he lost consciousness. Sebastian stared down at the pale face that was so like his own. And he knew a renewed surge of anger and regret, and a panicked sense of impending loss that he could do nothing to avert. Knox drew another ragged breath and opened his eyes. "It's bad, isn't it?" he said, his voice a hushed quaver. Sebastian felt his throat seize up, so that for a moment all he could do was set his jaw and nod. You asked about Diggory Flynn." "Never mind about Flynn. You need to save your breath." A ghost of amusement flitted across the former rifleman's features. "Save it for what?" "It's probably Flynn who killed me. They say he's a good shot." "Who is he?" Knox's head moved restlessly against his pillow. "He doesn't really exist, but there's—" His breath caught on a cough, and a line of blood spilled from the corner of his mouth. Sebastian reached for his handkerchief and carefully wiped away the blood. Knox licked his dry lips. "They say there's a Buckinghamshire vicar's son. Served as an exploring officer in the peninsula. Likes to use that name." "Who told you this?" "Doesn't matter. She doesn't know anymore." Knox's hand came up to grasp Sebastian's wrist. Tell Pippa I'm sorry. The boy—" He drew in a noisy, oddly sucking breath. "Should have married her. Know what it's like, growing up the bastard son of a barmaid. No. Too late. No. Sebastian took Knox's hand in both of his and gripped it with a determined fierceness. It's not too late. I can find a vicar, get a special license and— But Knox's hand lay limp in Sebastian's grasp. And as he watched, the eyes that were so much like his own grew unfocused and empty, and the bandaged chest lay ominously still. Breathe, damn you! Sebastian sank to both knees, the rifleman's hand still clenched tightly between his own as he watched, waited for the next breath. Breathe! He was aware of Hero coming to stand beside him, felt her touch on his shoulder, though he didn't look up. She stood beside him as the minutes stretched out, until the absence of life had shifted from a dread to an undeniable certainty. Finally, she said, I am so sorry, Devlin. He suddenly felt bone-tired, his eyes aching, a tight band squeezing his chest as he shook his head slowly from side to side. I don't even know who he was. Don't know if I just lost a brother or not. Does it matter? On one level, no. But I should know. A man should know his own brother, thought Sebastian. His own father. She turned toward him, cradling his head in her palms to draw his body against her soft warmth. The only sounds were the patter of the wind-driven rain striking the window panes, the fall of the ash on the hearth, and his own anguished breath. I thought he was you, Hero said to Sebastian later as she sat by the fire in the library, a forgotten cup of tea on the table at her side. I saw him coming around the corner from Bond Street as I was stepping down from the carriage. I called to him, called your name, and then I saw the bullet hit his chest, and I thought you were dead. I thought I'd lost you, and— She swallowed, her voice becoming shaky, hushed. I didn't know I could hurt that much inside. Then I realized it wasn't you, it was Knox, and I was glad because it meant you were still alive. Her face took on a stark, fierce look. God help me, I was glad. He knelt at her feet, his hands entwined with hers in her lap. He'd seen her shoot an attacker in the face and bash in a murderer's head without losing her composure or equanimity. But what had happened today had obviously shaken her badly. He could feel the fine trembling going on inside her still. She said, and then that poor woman, Pippa, came, and even though I felt sorry for her, all I could think was how relieved I was that it was her man who was dying. I knew it was wrong, but I couldn't help it, because if I lost you, I don't know how I'd bear it. His hands tightened on hers. He understood how she'd felt, because he'd known the same helpless despair when he thought he was about to lose her in childbirth. He said, I'm sorry, Hero. I'm so sorry. But I can't stop what I do, if that's what you're asking me. She loosed her hands from his grip to press her fingers against his lips. I'm not asking you to stop. I won't pretend I don't fear for you. I fear for myself, because I know my love for you makes me vulnerable. But I know, too, that what I feel is the same fear endured by every woman whose man ever marched off to war, every wife who watches her son or lover sail to sea, or go down in a mine to earn his bread. Risk is a part of what it means to be alive. We can't live our lives in a constant, paralyzing fear of death. Some do, he said, his lips moving against her fingers. A fierce light shone in her eyes. Yes, but I refuse to. Her words echoed something Cat Boleyn had said to him once, long ago. He shifted his hands to Hero's shoulders, leaned forward until his forehead was pressed against hers. I will be careful. I can promise you that. Once he'd been careless with his life, heedless of whether he lived or died. That was no longer true. She gave him a sad smile. I know. He kissed her, hard, on her mouth, then rose to unlock the upper right drawer in his desk and withdrew a sleek, walnut-handled dueling pistol. This was not the small double-barreled flintlock he often carried, which was easily concealed, but accurate only at close range. This pistol was made with a long, lightly rifled barrel that made it deadly even at some distance. "You think the shooter was Diggory Flynn?" she asked, watching as Sebastian set about loading and priming the pistol. "I'd say it's more than likely, yes. I think he was watching the house waiting for me. He saw Knox, and like you, he assumed Knox was me." Sebastian paused, his hands stilling at their task as the bitter truth of it all washed over him anew. "Knox died because he looked like me. He died in my place." She rested her hand on his arm. He thought she was going to tell him it wasn't his fault, that he couldn't keep blaming himself for deaths caused by others. Instead, she said, "Will you kill him?" "First, I'm going to find out who hired him." Sebastian slipped the pistol into the pocket of his caped greatcoat. "And then I'm going to kill him." Chapter 46. Sebastian spent the next hour or so frequenting taverns favoured by ex-military men, particularly those who'd served as exploring or observing officers. Most such men rode a war-torn countryside wearing their British uniforms lest they be caught and ignobly hanged as spies. But there were some who knew how to blend in with the local populace, to slip behind enemy lines and return again with none the wiser. It was frowned upon, of course, for a gentleman to use subterfuge and deception. Yet for thousands of years generals had relied upon those with such skills. Their motives differed. Some risked everything out of love of country, or for the sake of the men with whom they served, or because the vicissitudes of life had eroded their attachment to the things most other men held dear. But there were some who acted solely for the thrill of it all, for the joy of deception, and the opportunities it offered. Sebastian suspected Diggory Flynn fell into the latter category. It was in a smoky, run-down inn off Cursitor Street that Sebastian found the old acquaintance he was looking for, a one-legged former lieutenant named Dylan Rutherford, who peered at him over the rim of a brandy glass and said, "Diggory Flynn, what do you want with him?" "I want to kill him," said Sebastian, taking the seat opposite the lieutenant. A soundless chuckle shook the lieutenant's thin chest. "You and a fair number of other people. Unfortunately, he's not all that easy to kill." Rutherford was one of those men who looked as if he could be anywhere between 30 and 50, of medium height and slim build, with a gaunt face and thinning brown hair. He'd been born the youngest of a country squire's 5 sons. When he was 16, his family scraped together enough money to purchase his first pair of colours. But in more than 10 years of service, he'd managed to save enough to buy only 1 promotion. And after losing a leg and the use of his right arm at Medina de Riosico, he'd been invalided out. He now survived by tutoring small boys from a rented room near the Inns of Court. "Where can I find him?" asked Sebastian. Rutherford licked his lips. "Flynn isn't his real name." Sebastian ordered 2 brandies and slid one across the table toward Rutherford. "What is?" "He's used so many over the years that I have a hard time keeping them all straight. Barnes, Brady, something like that." "His father was a vicar." "So they say." The lieutenant sipped from his new glass of brandy. "Did he ever serve under Colonel Sinclair Oliphant?" The lieutenant widened his eyes. "You don't know?" "Know what?" "It was Oliphant kept him from being hanged when Wellesley was all for stringing him up in Lisbon, back in 1808. That would have been not long before Oliphant was made colonel of Sebastian's regiment. He said, "What had Flynn done?" "Killed a fellow officer in a fight over a woman." Flynn was the type best kept behind enemy lines. He had a habit of falling into trouble when left with too much time on his hands. What does he do now? I don't know. Heard he found himself in a bit of an awkward spot in Jamaica. He was in Jamaica? With Oliphant? Rutherford gave a shrug that could have meant anything. Oh, not officially, of course. But a man like Diggory Flynn can be useful, if you know what I mean. Where can I find him? Sebastian asked again. The lieutenant fingered his empty glass. Sebastian ordered another. Rutherford waited until the brandy appeared and took a drink before saying, I honestly don't know where you might find him. The fact is, you could run into him in the street and not recognize him. He's that good. What does he look like? I mean, really look like? The lieutenant frowned with the effort of memory. Red hair, about my size, maybe a bit fleshier these days. He's got one of those faces that blends easily into a crowd, although he's right clever at shifting the way he looks. Don't know how he does it. Only really distinctive thing about him is his eyes, and there's nothing he can do about them. His eyes? The lieutenant held up 2 fingers and pointed to his own somewhat bloodshot eyes. One's blue, and the other's brown. It's the queerest thing I've ever seen. Sinclair, Lord Oliphant, entered his elegant book-lined library and closed the door behind him. He carried a brace of candles, the flames flaring as he walked across the room to set it on the mantel. Then, as if becoming aware of another presence in the room, he froze. "Turn around very carefully," said Sebastian, thumbing back the hammer on his flintlock, "and keep your hands where I can see them." Oliphant pivoted slowly, his habitual, faintly contemptuous smile firmly in place, his hands spread out at his sides. "Who let you in?" "Do you really need to ask?" "Nice black eye." "Thank you." Oliphant's gaze drifted to a nearby window where the heavy velvet drapes shifted in a draught, but all he said was, "May I offer you a drink?" "Thank you, but no." "Mind if I have one?" "Not as long as you keep your hands in sight. And remember, I'd love an excuse to shoot you. And hang for murder, if necessary. The only reason you're not dead already is because I want Diggory Flynn. And because as much as I might suspect you're the one controlling him, I can't prove it. Yet." Oliphant moved to where brandy and a set of glasses waited on a table beside the fire. His movements were deliberate, but seemingly untroubled, as if he was still utterly in control of the situation. "Diggory Flynn," Sebastian said again. "I want him." Oliphant's attention was all for the task of pouring his brandy. "Who?" Sebastian found his finger tightening on the trigger and had to force himself to relax. "Allow me to refresh your memory. Former exploring officer, hails from a vicarage in Buckinghamshire by way of Lisbon, where he should have hanged, but, thanks to your intervention, did not." Oliphant set aside his decanter with a soft thump. "You've been very busy. So has Flynn, or Barnes, or Brady, or whatever his real name happens to be, except that rather than murdering me as intended, he shot and killed a Bishopsgate tavern owner who happens to look a fair bit like me. Oh? Now there's a pity. That an innocent man is dead, or that I'm still alive." Oliphant turned to face him, the brandy cradled in one hand. "As it happens, an exploring officer who liked to use the name Diggory Flynn did once serve under me, but I haven't seen him since I left Jamaica." "Why was he there?" "In Jamaica?" Oliphant shrugged. "How should I know? Needless to say, we didn't exactly move in the same social circles. In fact, Preston P.3 accused him of working with a gang of slave runners operating in the area." "The same allegations were made against you?" "Nasty lies, of course. Unfortunately, in Flynn's case, I suspect the accusation may well have been true. He was arrested and sentenced to hang. only somehow managed to escape. One of his talents? Oh, he's very talented. Oliphant took a slow sip of his brandy. My point is, the man you call Diggory Flynn had a powerful grudge against the Prestons. You're suggesting Flynn had his own reasons for killing Stanley Preston, are you? The man always did have a tendency to carry a grudge. What's his real name? Oliphant huffed a laugh. I honestly can't remember. Where would I find him? I haven't the slightest idea. He's fallen in with some rough elements since leaving the army. Not only slave runners, but smugglers as well. Sebastian rose to his feet, the pistol still in his hand. If I discover proof that you're lying, I'll kill you. Oliphant raised one eyebrow in polite incredulity. And risk leaving your young wife a widow, and your newborn son an orphan? I think not. Sebastian paused at the door to look back at him. You and I both know there are ways to kill without being caught. Oliphant paused with his brandy lifted halfway to his lips. Are you saying you'd commit cold-blooded murder for the sake of a common tavern owner? For Jamie Knox, and for the women and children of Santa Iria. The French killed the women and children of Santa Iria. So they did, said Sebastian, and walked out of the library and out of the house. Chapter 47. Pippa was filling 3 pewter tankards with ale when Sebastian pushed open the door to the Black Devil's tap room. The tavern was crowded with its usual evening assortment of tradesmen, apprentices, and labourers. The smell of spilled spirits hung heavy in the smoky air, and bursts of hearty laughter punctuated the soft roar of the men's voices. As the door closed behind him, she looked up and saw him, and for a moment she froze. Then she swallowed hard and went back to her task. "Is he dead, then?" she asked as Sebastian walked up to the counter, her attention seemingly all for the tankards of ale. "Yes." He saw a quiver pass over her features, but she simply set her jaw and said nothing. He said, "The boy, Knox's son, if he should ever require anything, I want you to know that all you need do is ask." She looked up then, her eyes glazed with unshed tears, her face tight with anger. "What's he to you, anyway?" Sebastian met her furious gaze. "I honestly don't know." She hefted the 3 tankards with practised ease and carried them to the men at a nearby table. When she came back, she grabbed a cloth and set about wiping the surface of the bar as if indifferent to Sebastian's presence. He said, "What do you know of Knox's family in Shropshire?" She twitched one shoulder, her fist clenching on the cloth. "What's there to know? His mum died when he was just a wee babe." "Who raised him?" "His nana." "His grandmother? Is she still alive?" "Last we heard. Just this afternoon he was talking about maybe going to see her soon. Had something he wanted to give her." "What?" She threw the cloth aside and disappeared into the back room to return in a moment with a gilded mechanical nightingale that she slammed down on the counter before him. Sebastian picked it up with a hand that was not quite steady, the jewels in its collar flaming with colour as they caught the firelight. "Where did this come from?" "Got it off Pris Mulligan, he did. Said his nana was always partial to nightingales." "Knox went to Houndsditch this afternoon?" He watched as a fearful light came into Pippa's eyes. She said, "You know he did." He hadn't known it. In fact, it made no sense, although he remembered the rifleman saying, "She doesn't know any more." "What can you tell me about a man named Diggory Flynn?" Pippa wrinkled her nose and shook her head. "Never heard of him." "Knox didn't mention him?" "No." He studied her closed, resentful face. She had always regarded him with both animosity and suspicion. instinctively knowing him for a threat, even as his resemblance to Knox confused and frightened her. Now the father of her son was dead, and she held Sebastian responsible. And the truth was that if Sebastian had never come into their lives, Jamie Knox would still be alive. He set the mechanical nightingale on the counter between them. "I'm sorry." She shoved the gilded bird toward him. "Take it. I don't want it. I never want to see it again." "You could send it to his grandmother," he suggested. Yet even as he said it, he knew she never would. She stared at him, her eyes glittering with raw hatred. He picked up the nightingale. "What's her name?" "Hetty. Hetty Kincaid. Lives in a village called Ayleswick, just outside of Ludlow." He slipped an envelope thick with banknotes from his pocket and laid it before her. No amount of money could compensate for the loss of her son's father, but it would make her life, and the boys', easier. "I'll let you know when the funeral arrangements have been made," he said. He thought she might object, might even throw his money in his face. But she didn't. Sebastian was sitting beside the library fire, the mechanical nightingale in his hands, his gaze on the coals glowing on the hearth, when Hero came to stand in the room's entrance. "Did you kill him?" she asked, pausing with one hand on the door-frame beside her. He looked up at her. "If you mean Diggory Flynn, the answer is no. I haven't been able to find him. And if you mean Oliphant, I'm afraid the answer is still no. I'll admit I came damned close. But you were right. I can't be completely certain that Oliphant is the one controlling Flynn. Still, I know Flynn was an exploring officer under Oliphant, and that both men were in Jamaica together, but—" He held up the gilded bird. "I'm puzzled by this." "What is it?" He wound the key and set the nightingale on the table beside him, the clear, heart-breakingly beautiful notes filling the air as the bird's mechanical wings rose and fell. "It appears that Knox learned of Flynn's identity from Pris Mulligan. According to Oliphant, Flynn has been using his talents in a variety of nefarious pursuits, from slave-running to smuggling." "Smuggling?" "Well, you did first see him in Houndsditch." "I did." "So he could work for Pris Mulligan." He could indeed. He watched the mechanical toy slowly wind down and stop. "It seems as if just when I think I'm beginning to understand what happened to Preston and Sterling and Toop, everything shifts, and I realize I don't understand anything at all." Hero walked over to pick up the mechanical nightingale and wind the key. Then she set it on the table, and together they watched the gilded wings beat slowly up and down in the glow of the firelight. Chapter 48. Tuesday, 30th of March. The next morning dawned cold and misty, with a bitter wind blowing down out of the north. Pris Mulligan was wrapped in a heavy shawl, and poking around the jumble of old glass and metal items displayed on a Houndsditch street stall when Sebastian walked up to her. "I understand you know Diggory Flynn," he said. She looked over at him, her lower lip distended by a plug of tobacco, her beady black eyes widening ever so slightly. "Oh? And now you know that. Deduction." "Ain't ne'er heard of nobody named Deduction," she said with a sniff, and returned her attention to the second-hand stall. Sebastian watched her pick up a tarnished old candlestick and squint at it. He said, "You heard Knox is dead?" "Aye." She heaved a heavy sigh. "'Tis a pity. He was a good-looking lad, that one." "I think Diggory Flynn killed him." "Now, what would he want to go and do that for? Because he mistook Knox for me?" Pris Mulligan stared thoughtfully at Sebastian, then turned her head to shoot a stream of tobacco juice into the gutter. "Aye, 'tis possible, I suppose. There's no denying the two of you is as alike as a couple of pups out of the same litter." Sebastian said, I think Flynn is working for you. Or Sinclair Oliphant, or Anne Preston, he thought, watching her carefully. She used her tongue to shift the wad of tobacco to her cheek. Sure then, but Flynn ain't ne'er worked for me. With me, maybe, from time to time, but ne'er for me. And why should I believe you? She shrugged. Ask anybody knows him. I could ask him myself, if I knew where to find him. Her lips pulled into a wide grin that showed her small tobacco-stained teeth. Oh, you think I'm going to tell you, do you? Not likely. She winked. Fact is, I couldn't even if I wanted to. He contacts me, not t'other way round. He watched her set aside the candlestick and reach for a small glass figurine. He said, You're Irish, aren't you? The question obviously took her by surprise, because she hesitated and looked up at him again. What's that got to do with anything? Have you ever heard of a Doulahan? Course I have. Why? Tell me about it. She dropped her voice low and waved one small, childlike hand through the air like a storyteller conjuring an image. Keeps his own head tucked up under one arm, he does. Ooh, he's a fright to look at. Little black eyes always darting this way and that, with a grinning mouth as wide as his skull and skin like mouldy cheese. Carries a whip made from a dead man's backbone, and when he calls your name, it's your turn to die. Ain't nothing you can do to stop him. You can try barring your gate and locking your door, but they'll just open for him like magic. He rides a horse. Sometimes. Sometimes he drives a carriage. She sniffed. What you want to know about the Doulahan? He don't like being watched, you know. You try watching him and he'll pluck out your eyes with his whip. That will throw a bucket of blood on you, marking you as the next to die. I hear there's one thing that will scare him away. She gave a breathy laugh, her small eyes practically disappearing in the fat of her face as she fished beneath her shawl and came up with a bored gold coin tied around her neck by a leather thong. Sure then, 'tis gold. Why do you think the rich don't die as often as the poor? Lots of food, a warm fire, a solid roof over their heads. Maybe, she said with a sniff. Though I still don't see what the Doulahan's got to do with nothing. Perhaps it doesn't, said Sebastian, and walked away, leaving her staring after him, the glass figurine held forgotten in one fist, and her eyes narrowed with malevolent suspicion. Chapter 49. The little girl clutched the rusty tray of nuts against her thin chest. She was a tiny thing, with spindly arms and legs, a pale, wind-chapped face, and lifeless hair, the same dull brown as her eyes. She told Hero her name was Sarah Devon. She was 9 years old, and she'd already been selling nuts for 3 years. I didn't start on the streets till after Papa died, she told Hero. He was a whitesmith, you know, sold tin and pewter. For a while, Mama tried to keep us on what she makes selling oranges, but it weren't enough. So she took to sending me out with 6 halfpennies worth of nuts. I'm supposed to bring back 6pence. What happens if you don't? The little girl's gaze slid away. She don't usually beat me, only when she's been drinking, and she don't drink more than once a week. Usually. Hero's sympathy for the struggling widow instantly vanished. You always sell your nuts here, in Piccadilly? Mostly, me lady, although sometimes I goes into the public houses. I like the tap rooms. It's warm in there. Hero looked up from scribbling her notes. You sell your nuts in taverns? She tried to keep the shock off her face, but she must not have entirely succeeded because Sarah took a hesitant step back. I usually only goes into the Pied Duck, said Sarah, shifting nervously from one foot to the other. The barman used to be a friend of Papa's, and if he's there, he doesn't let the men be rude to me. Are the men rude? The little girl hung her head. Sometimes. Hero's fist clenched around her pencil so hard she heard it crack. "Here," she said, pressing 2 shillings into the little girl's hand. "Only don't give it all to your mother at once, or she's liable to drink it up." Sarah's fingers closed round the coins, her eyes going wide. "I thought you said you'd give me 1 shilling if I talked to you. So why are you giving me 2? "Because you're so thin and frail it breaks my heart," thought Hero. "Because I don't want you to have to worry about being beaten when you go home. Because little girls shouldn't need to sell nuts in taverns to survive." But all she said was, "Because you've been so very helpful." Sarah tipped her head to one side. "You really going to write about us costers in the newspapers?" "Yes." She looked thoughtful. "I don't mind going out in the street to sell, you know. It's better than staying inside, without a fire, and with nothing to do." Which was, Hero decided as she walked back to her carriage with the 2 footmen Devlin had insisted she bring with her, a consolation of sorts, but only if she didn't think too much about it. Chapter 50. "I don't understand why we keep coming here," said Tom, standing beside the chestnuts' heads at the edge of the lane while Sebastian walked over to study the narrow, moss-covered arch of Bloody Bridge. "Because I know I'm missing something." "What makes you think it's here?" "It may not be," said Sebastian, which only served to make Tom look more puzzled. Sebastian stared off across the rolling green expanse of Market Gardens, still half hidden by lingering wisps of the morning's fog. "Think about this. The Friday before he is killed, Stanley Preston has an unpleasant encounter with the former governor of Jamaica. We don't know exactly where this meeting takes place or what is said, but knowing Oliphant, I suspect it involves some nasty and rather explicit threats against Anne Preston. Whatever it is, it frightens Preston enough that the next day he tells his cousin, the Home Secretary, that he has given up his determination to see Oliphant ruined." "So that means the governor didn't have no reason to kill him no more, right?" "Perhaps," said Sebastian, "unless, for some reason, Preston changed his mind. At any rate, later that same day, Saturday, he charges into Pris Mulligan's shop in Houndsditch and threatens to turn her over to the authorities, at which point she threatens to have him gutted, strangled, and gelded." "Does that scare him?" "From all I know of Pris Mulligan, it should have. But even if it does, he's obviously still feeling cantankerous because—" "What?" "Cantankerous. It means foul-tempered, testy, bloody-minded." "Oh." "Because he then goes storming into the Shepherd's Rest and threatens to horsewhip the impecunious Captain Wyeth, at which point Wyeth, in turn, threatens to kill him." "He was a right ornery fellow, this Preston. What d'you call it?" "Cantankerous," said Sebastian, his gaze following the course of the narrow rivulet that ran under the bridge. Now, the next morning, Sunday, the day of the murder, Preston receives a visit from Dr. Douglas Sterling. The doctor claims the visit is for medical reasons, although no one close to Preston seems to know he's ill in any way. And after the physician leaves, Preston calls for a hackney and drives off to Bucket Lane for reasons that seem to escape everyone. He returns home several hours later and putters about with his collections until shortly before 9, when he looks out his window to see Basil Thistlewood staring at his house. Preston charges out to indulge himself in a decidedly uncouth shouting match in the street. Then, sometime after that, he leaves the house again and walks to the Monster, where he berates Henry Austen for what he sees as the Austen women's tendency to encourage Anne's romantic notions. "And then he comes here," said Tom. "He does. Presumably to meet Rowan Toop, who is selling the purloined head and coffin strap of King Charles I. Preston is standing here." Sebastian stepped onto the grassy verge beside the lane, with his watch in his hand, undoubtedly gazing back towards Sloane Square in anticipation of Toop's arrival, when— Sebastian turned so he was facing the square and frowned. "What?" said Tom, as Sebastian swung around again to study the overgrown thicket of shrubbery that choked both banks of the stream to the north of the bridge. Preston was stabbed in the back. That means that he either deliberately turned his back on his killer, which is unlikely if that person had recently threatened to kill him, or the killer crept up behind him. I've been thinking the killer probably followed Preston from the monster, except that if he had, Preston would surely have seen him as he stared back toward the square watching for Toop. Which means that whoever killed Preston must have known he was planning to meet Rowan Toop at Bloody Bridge that night, and was already here waiting for him, probably in the shadows of that shrubbery. The tiger's face lit up with quick comprehension. "So, who knew Preston was going to be here?" "It's possible Thistlewood learned of the meeting from Toop, but I doubt it. I also find it unlikely that Henry Austen was privy to Preston's clandestine activities. Preston's daughter Anne claims she had no idea what he was doing at Bloody Bridge that night, but could easily be lying. So she could have told Captain Wyeth. She could have, although I think it more likely she hired Diggory Flynn and sent him to kill Preston." Tom's jaw sagged. "You think she's done for her own dar? Gaw!" "She's definitely been moved into the suspects column," said Sebastian. "But men like Diggory Flynn are trained to learn other people's secrets. So it's conceivable that Flynn could have found out about the assignation, even if he was working for Pris Mulligan or Lord Oliphant." Sebastian's gaze returned to the square, where a gentlewoman had emerged from Sloane Street to turn along the side of the square and enter the lane leading to the bridge. She wore a plain brown pelisse and a sensible hat, and her gait was the strong, easy stride of someone accustomed to walking miles along country lanes and across fields. She had her head bowed and appeared lost in thought, but when she looked up and saw him, she smiled. "Lord Devlin," said Jane Austen, "I wasn't expecting to meet you again." He moved toward her. "Miss Austen, what brings you this way?" "I try to take a walk every morning, either to the river or through 5 fields. There's a small country chapel just there, with a lovely churchyard." She nodded toward the bell tower barely visible above the distant clump of trees. Then her gaze fell on the bridge, and a shadow crossed her small, even features. "It was one of Anne's favourite walks as well, but I doubt she'll ever want to come this way again." "And how is Miss Preston?" he asked. The question was not as idle as it seemed. "To be frank, she's making herself ill with the fear you mean to see Captain Wyeth hanged for her father's murder." "I don't believe Captain Wyeth killed Stanley Preston," he said, studying the novelist's round, small-featured face. He wished he could say the same thing about Anne, but he kept that thought to himself. "May I tell her that?" said Miss Austen. "Of course, although I obviously don't speak for Bow Street." "I think Anne is more afraid of you than she is of the authorities." "Oh, that surprises you?" "My cousin Eliza likewise fears that you may still suspect Henry." "I don't think your brother has anything to worry about either," he said. "How is Mrs. Austen today?" A pinched, bleak light came into Miss Austen's face. "I'm afraid it's only a matter of time." "I'm sorry." She blinked rapidly and nodded, her throat working as she swallowed. He said, "You wouldn't by chance know a man named Diggory Flynn? A somewhat dishevelled character with an oddly crooked face." "I don't believe so, no." "Why? You think he could be involved in what happened here?" "He may be." She tipped her head to one side. "May I ask why you've changed your mind about Captain Wyeth?" "Largely because I've come to believe he is precisely the honourable, conscientious man he appears." "That is good to hear," she said, with a soft smile. "Anne deserves to be happy." "Let's hope she will be," he said, just as the bells of the distant country chapel began to toll. Chapter 51. Sebastian's next stop was the Rose and Crown, where he discovered that Cian O'Neill had never returned to work in the stables. He found the former stable boy hoeing rows of newly sprouting vegetables in the kitchen gardens of Chelsea Hospital. At the sight of Sebastian, he froze, his fists tightening around the handle of his hoe and his chest jerking on a quickly indrawn breath. "What you want with me?" "I need to ask you a few questions," said Sebastian, pausing some feet away when the boy looked as if he might bolt. "I already told that other fella. I didn't see nothing. Nothing." Sebastian studied the lad's tight, strained face. "What other fella?" "The fella from Bow Street." "The one who spoke to you before?" "No, a different one." "Did he ask you about the Doulahan?" Cian stared at him, eyes wide and afraid. "You saw it, didn't you?" said Sebastian. "Nobody sees the Doulahan and lives." "So perhaps what you saw wasn't the Doulahan? Perhaps it was simply a man?" "But he was carrying a—" Cian broke off and dropped his gaze to the ground, his cheeks flaming with his shame. "A head? Is that what you saw? Not the severed head at the end of the bridge, but another head?" The boy wiped one ragged cuff across the end of his nose and nodded. "Won't nobody believe me, but it's true." "I believe you," said Sebastian. "Where was this man when you saw him?" Cian kept his gaze on his feet, his voice barely more than a whisper. "The other side of the bridge, not far from the barn we was going to." "What did he look like?" "I dunno. It was dark, and he was wearing some sort of flowing black robes, with a floppy hat on his head." "You mean on the head attached to his own shoulders? Not on the head he carried?" The colour in the boy's cheeks deepened. "Aye." "So it couldn't have been the Doulahan. It was simply a man dressed in a black cassock and carrying a head." The boy looked up, his features contorted with a swirling inner agony of confusion and a nameless fear that wasn't going to go away. "But whose head? You tell me that. Ain't no other body missing a head that I heard of." "Did you see anyone else at the bridge that night? Perhaps nothing more than a shadow moving in the shrubbery edging the stream?" The boy took a step back, then another. He was sweating now, although the day was cold, the wind flattening the thin cloth of his smock against his chest. "I don't know what I seen no more. I told that fella from Bow Street. It was dark, and the wind was blowing the trees something fierce." Sebastian frowned. "This man from Bow Street, when was he here, asking you questions?" "I dunno. Some days ago." "What did he look like?" "Just fine he was, like a gentleman. Not flashy, but real fine." "How old?" The boy shrugged. "Older than you, I suppose, but not by too much." "Dark or fair? Tall or short? Thin or fleshy?" The lad's features contorted with the effort of memory. "About as tall as me and dark-headed, but I wouldn't say he was either overly thin or fleshy." Sebastian knew all of Lovejoy's constables, and the boy's description fit none of them. "He told you he was from Bow Street?" "Aye." "Did he ask you anything else?" "Only if Molly'd seen anything." "What did you tell him?" "I said no." "If she'd seen what I seen, she wouldn't be laughing at me. She wouldn't be going around telling folks I'm simple-minded." "I don't think you're simple-minded. But the man who asked you those questions wasn't from Bow Street." The boy's face went slack. "What you saying?" "I'm saying that if you see him again, you need to be careful." "But who is he?" "I think he may very well be the killer." Sebastian arrived back at Brook Street to be met by Murray wearing a disapproving face. "A lady to see you, my lord," said the major-domo, Miss Anne Preston. I told her both you and Lady Devlin were out, but she insisted on waiting." His frown deepened. "I've put her in the drawing-room." "Thank you," said Sebastian, handing Maury his hat and walking-stick as he headed for the stairs. She was sitting stiffly upright on one of the cane chairs by the bow window, her hands clenched in her lap, her face a tight, unsmiling mask of control. At the sight of Sebastian, she thrust up from the chair, her arms held stiffly at her sides. "I'm here because of Jane, Miss Austen," she said without preamble. "May I offer you some tea, Miss Preston?" "No, thank you. Your major domo already did." She drew in a deep breath and said in a rush, I'm afraid I haven't been exactly honest with you about some things." Sebastian suspected she hadn't been honest with him about a number of things, but all he said was, "Please, have a seat." "No." She jerked away to stand at the window, looking out at the scene below. "Bow Street thinks Hugh killed Father, but Jane, Miss Austen, tells me you don't agree with them." Sebastian studied her tightly held profile. "Exactly what are you trying to tell me, Miss Preston?" She kept her gaze on the carts and carriages filling the street. "Hugh had this idea that if he could meet with Father, talk to him man to man, then maybe he could convince Father to change his mind about our marriage." "Was this before or after your father stormed into the Shepherd's Rest and threatened to horsewhip him?" She sucked in a quick breath that flared her nostrils and caused her chest to jerk. "After." "So, Sunday?" "Yes. I told Hugh he was mad, that Father would never agree, but Hugh said he was honour bound to formally ask for my hand in marriage." "Admirable." She gave a small, ragged laugh. "Admirable, perhaps, but mad nonetheless." "So what happened?" She ran her fingers down the curtain beside her to smooth it, although it was already hanging straight. "A predictable disaster. It probably didn't help that Hugh arrived at the house just after Douglas Sterling had been there. I don't know what Dr. Sterling told Father, but whatever it was, it left him in an odd humour. He took one look at Hugh and flew into a rage, right there, in the hall, in front of Shambliss, our butler." "You obviously have very loyal servants," said Sebastian. "None of them breathed a word of Captain Wyeth's visit to the constables." "I begged Shambliss to keep it to himself. It was wrong of me, I know, but I feared Bow Street would put the worst possible construction on Hugh's visit. I mean, Father was standing in the hall shouting that he'd see me die an old maid before he'd allow me to align our house with some penniless vicar's son." "You were present at their meeting?" "Not at first, no. Hugh had thought they'd do better alone. But the way Papa was shouting, it's a wonder they didn't hear him in the next county. I tried to stay away, but I finally couldn't bear it any longer and came downstairs. I told Papa that if I couldn't marry Hugh, I would die an old maid, and that if he was opposing the match in the hopes that I would become Lady Knightley instead, then he was living in cloud cuckoo land." She paused, her face wan and tired. "That's when Papa said the strangest thing. You must understand that he'd been wildly enthusiastic at the prospect of a match between Sir Galen and me. But when I mentioned Knightley's name, Papa flew into such a rage he was shaking. Said he'd rather see me married to some English chimney-sweep than Sir Galen. He rounded on Shambliss, who was still standing there with a wooden face — it was most mortifying — and told him that if Sir Galen ever came to the door again, he was not to be admitted. Then Papa grabbed his hat and stormed off." "In the Hackney?" "Yes. Bow Street says he went to Fish Street Hill, although I can't for the life of me imagine what could have taken him there." Sebastian now thought he had a fairly good idea what might have driven Stanley Preston to the streets surrounding Billingsgate Market, but all he said was, "When you quarrelled with Captain Wyeth at Lady Farningham's, was it over that morning's confrontation with your father?" "Not exactly." A touch of colour crept into her face. "If you must know, I wanted Hugh to agree to elope. I knew Father would fly into one of his rages over it, but I was convinced he'd eventually calm down and accept our marriage, particularly if, for some reason, he'd given up his dream of seeing me as Lady Knightley." But Captain Wyeth refused. The colour in her cheeks darkened. "Yes." Sebastian said, "What made you decide to tell me this now?" "It was something Miss Austen said. She said I was wrong to keep back anything that happened that day, that each event by itself might not seem to mean anything, but that, when taken together with everything else, it might very well provide the key you need to understand what happened to Father." She tented her hands over her nose and mouth, her eyes squeezing shut a moment before she said, "I didn't tell you of it before, because I was afraid it would make you even more convinced that it was Hugh who killed Papa. But he didn't. You must believe me. He's not some conniving fortune hunter. He's a worthy, honourable man, far more noble and high-minded than I am. He didn't kill my father." "No," said Sebastian, "but I think I know who did." Chapter 52. Sometimes solving a murder could be as simple as asking the right questions, except that in this case Sebastian hadn't been asking the right questions, at least not about the right person. He spent the next several hours visiting those London coffee-houses and pubs favoured by men with extensive connections to the West Indies. The conversations were oblique, the queries carefully worded, the answers often guarded or merely suggestive. But in the end, the information he gleaned was damning. Hero was strolling the rear gardens with a bundled-up Simon in her arms when Sebastian walked up to her. Her cheeks were pleasantly flushed by the cool air, but her eyes were troubled, and he knew that whatever costermonger's story of hardship and deprivation she'd heard that morning still haunted her. He said, "Difficult interview." She drew a deep breath and shifted Simon's weight so that she could press her cheek against the child's. "A little girl. She sells nuts in taverns. Alone." He wanted to say, "Why don't you stop doing this to yourself? Why torment yourself with the ugly realities of a part of London life of which most gentlewomen remain blissfully ignorant?" But he knew that was precisely what she wanted to change. She wanted the spoiled, complacent, self-satisfied residents of the West End to know what life was like for those less fortunate. In her own way, she was as driven as he. The baby fussed, and she loosened her hold on him, saying, "I've heard back from my Fish Street Hill costermonger. He contacted me after I talked to Sarah. And he says Stanley Preston was in Bucket Lane to see a woman. Unfortunately, she refuses to speak with us, although he did accidentally let slip a name. Juba." Juba. It was an African name, often given in the American colonies to girls born on a Monday morning. Sebastian suspected it belonged to the beautiful, dusky-skinned woman who had confronted him in the lane. "You think this Juba could be Preston's daughter?" said Hero. "Actually, I think it's far more likely her connection is to Sir Galen Knightley." "Knightley?" Hero stared at him. "Are you serious?" She listened while he told her of the sudden aversion to Knightley that Preston had expressed the morning of his murder, of the dark-haired gentleman who had questioned Cian O'Neill, and of Sebastian's own conversations with various West Indies planters. "Knightley told me once that he inherited his plantations and slaves," said Sebastian. "He claimed to be a kindly master who would gladly free all of his slaves if the law didn't make it so onerous. But none of that is true. He actually extended his holdings of both land and slaves in the years since his great-uncle's death. And while there isn't a planter in Jamaica who doesn't make use of the whip, I'm told Knightley's punishments can be unusually brutal, particularly if he's enraged. They say he doesn't lose his temper often, but when he does, he's vicious. He once personally slashed a slave's throat with a cane knife when the man mishandled a favourite mare. Killed him? Yes. Practically took off the poor man's head, although of course they made up some tale for the authorities. So what do you think Stanley Preston and Douglas Sterling could have done that drove Knightley into a murderous rage? I think Sterling must have told Preston something that Sunday morning, something that convinced Preston he didn't want his daughter to marry Knightley, and that sent him to talk to Juba in Bucket Lane. But Preston knew Knightley well. He had to know of his temper and his treatment of his slaves. So what could Sterling possibly have said that would suddenly turn Preston against the man? Knightley told me once that Preston had a horror of miscegenation, and Juba is part African. You think she could be Knightley's daughter? No, she's not young enough for that. But she could very well have had a child by him. Dear God, said Hero softly. Would he kill her too, do you think, if he thought she was a threat to him? Sebastian reached out to lift his son from her arms and hold Simon close. This is a man who owns other human beings and has them whipped when they refuse to work, who's capable of slitting a helpless slave's throat for mishandling a horse, and who probably bashed in the skull of Rowan Toop on the off chance the verger might have seen something that could incriminate him. So, yes, I think he'd kill her, if he thought she might betray him. Her and her child both. Chapter 53. It was early afternoon by the time Sebastian reached Fish Street Hill. The crowds had thinned, the cries of the sellers in Billingsgate Market largely stilled. Leaving the curricle with Tom, he cut through the noisome alley to Bucket Lane. The sky had grown increasingly dark and heavy with clouds, the light thin and white and flat, the lane deserted, except for a knot of ragged children playing some game with broken pieces of brick. Sebastian walked up to one of the lads, a delicately boned, brown-eyed boy of perhaps 10 or 12, and held up a coin. "I'm looking for Juba. A shilling if you lead me to her." The boy stared at Sebastian with a hard, emotionless face. Then he made a quick grab at the coin. Said Sebastian, lifting the shilling out of his reach. "You'll get it, but not until you've led me to Juba." The boy's expression never altered. Then his gaze broke to someone behind Sebastian. "It's you, ain't it?" said a familiar voice. Sebastian turned to find the woman called Juba standing in the middle of the lane, her fists on her slim hips, her head thrown back as she stared at him with suspicion and hostility, and what he recognized as a touch of curiosity. "Yes," he said. "Who are you, really?" "Lord Devlin. I want to know why Stanley Preston came to see you last Sunday. He didn't come to see me." "Then who did he see?" She shook her head. "First you want me to believe you're an idiot, and now you're pretending to be some grand lord." "I am a lord. Not exactly what I'd call grand, but a lord nonetheless." She huffed a scornful expulsion of air. "And what are you claiming is your interest in Preston this time, my lord?" "I'm trying to figure out who killed him, and why." He saw a sudden leap of fear in those turquoise-hued eyes. "I didn't kill him," she said huskily. "I had no reason to kill him." "I know. What difference it make to you who killed this Preston, or why?" "I happen to have a moral objection to people getting away with cold-blooded murder." "Sure, then," she said, her lip curling. "Rich man gets himself killed. Everybody from Fleet Street to Bow Street is interested in finding who done it. But let somebody stab an old fishmonger in the back, and ain't nobody cares." Sebastian shook his head. "I don't understand. Come, I'll show you." She turned and strode toward a nearby battered door without waiting to see if he followed, as if whether he did so or not were a matter of supreme indifference to her. He found himself in a narrow, dilapidated corridor, smelling strongly of fish, thanks to the dripping pile of baskets and hampers stacked near the street. She pushed open the first door to the left, revealing a room that was small and meanly furnished, but clean, with a scrubbed trestle table and crude benches, and 2 pallets laid out near the cold hearth. On one of the pallets lay the body of an old woman, her face pale and waxy with death. She looked to be perhaps 60 years old or more, her café au lait skin wrinkled and sunken with age, her hair steel-grey and thin. But once she must have been beautiful, for the exquisite, regal bone structure she had bequeathed to her daughter was still clearly visible, despite the ravages of age and mortality. Sebastian raised his gaze from the dead woman to Juba. "When was she killed?" "Last night. They be coming any time now to sew her into her shroud." "Tell me what happened." "Ain't nothing to tell. She went out to fetch water, only she never come back. Banjo went looking and found her not 5 feet from the pump. Breathed her last in his arms." "Banjo? My boy?" She jerked her head toward the street. "That's him you was talking to just now." Sebastian studied her beautiful, tightly held face, and read there a powerful mixture of grief and shock and fury. He said, "Tell me why Stanley Preston came here a week ago Sunday." She stared back at him. "Why should I?" "Because whoever killed your mother also killed Stanley Preston, and at least 2 other men. And because, if he feels threatened, he may not stop there. He may decide he needs to eliminate you and your son as well." A pulse had begun to beat wildly at the base of her long, elegant neck, but a lifetime of suspicion and resentment held her silent. "Tell me," he said softly. She went to stand before the cold hearth, where a few chipped cups and plates rested on a rough shelf. He said, "I'll see that you come to no harm." She gave a harsh laugh. "Why should I believe you?" "Do you have a choice?" She stared back at him, her hands fisting in her apron, her strangely hued eyes wide with fear and mistrust. "Tell me," he said again. Slowly, haltingly, she began to talk, and as he listened, Sebastian came to realize that he had misjudged Knightley's motives entirely, that the secrets the man had killed to protect were far more dangerous than Sebastian had ever imagined. When she finished, he said, "I want you and your boy to come away from here. Come with me, so that I can keep you safe until this is all over." "No." "Don't you understand? What do you think?" She took a quick step toward him, one arm slashing through the air as she cut him off, her features stiff with an anger born of a lifetime of slights and insults. "That I'm a fool, or as much of an idiot as your Silas Nelson? No, I ain't putting our lives in your hands. This is our home. Here, we're surrounded by people who knows us, people we trusts. Costermongers always take care of their own. You got what you come for. Now, get out of here." He drew a calling card from his pocket and held it out to her. "If you change your mind, or if anyone should threaten you in any way, come to me. Number 41, Brook Street." She made no move to take the card, and it occurred to him she probably couldn't read it if she did. Hero had told him that fewer than 1 out of 10 of the city's costermongers were literate. He laid the card on the trestle tabletop. "I'm sorry about your mother," he said. But she only stared back at him, her face hollow with grief and eyes cold with resentment. Sebastian's next stop was Blackfriars Bridge, where he had a short conversation with the owner of Douglas Sterling's favourite coffee shop. Then he drove to Park Lane, where he found his Aunt Henrietta's shiny carriage drawn up outside her townhouse, and the Dowager Duchess herself smoothing on a pair of elegant kid gloves in the grand entrance hall. "I don't have time to talk to you now, Devlin," she told him, still busy with her gloves. "I'm on my way to Sally Jersey's." "This won't take long. I want to know what you can tell me about the birth of Sir Galen Knightley." "Knightley?" She looked up at him. "Good heavens! Has someone killed him now?" "No." She stared at Sebastian, her blue, sincere eyes going wide and still with comprehension. Then she glanced at her wooden-faced butler and said, "Tell Coachman John I shan't be but a moment." She led Sebastian to a small withdrawing room. Sebastian said, "That bad, is it? Well, it's certainly not a tale I'd care to relate in front of the servants. Sir Galen's father was Beaumont Knightley, eldest son of the old baronet Sir Maxwell Knightley, and as dissolute a young man as ever joined the Hellfire Club, which is truly saying something, I'm afraid. Gambling, drinking, women, duelling, the usual, only far, far worse. If even half the tales told of his conduct were true, he must have cost his father a fortune. In the end, old Sir Maxwell shipped him off to a maternal uncle who owned plantations in the West Indies." "Jamaica?" "Yes. Most people thought old Sir Maxwell was hoping the yellow fever would carry the reprobate off, so that a younger brother could inherit." "Only no such luck?" "Not quickly enough, at any rate. The young man hadn't been on the island a month before he seduced the daughter of a local plantation owner. As I understand it, the girl's father was on the verge of shooting the ne'er-do-well when she announced she was with child, so Beau Knightley was allowed to live, on the condition he make an honest woman of the foolish chit." "Doesn't sound like anyone I'd want as a son-in-law," said Sebastian. Henrietta shrugged. Perhaps the girl's father intended to shoot the rascal after the child was born, but in the end he didn't need to. Both Beau Knightley and his bride died of the fever less than a year later." "What happened to the child?" "He also fell ill with the fever, but obviously survived. He was eventually brought to England to be raised by his grandfather. Carelessly conceived the boy may have been, but he was still old Sir Maxwell's heir after all." "Maybe," thought Sebastian, "or maybe not." "Tell me about this maternal uncle." "Kitch McGill? Good heavens, why do you want to know about him?" "Humour me." "Well, let's see. He was a younger son, of course. The family sent him off to Jamaica after he half-killed some constable with his bare hands. He did quite well for himself there in the end, but he's been dead 20 or 30 years now. Never did have any children of his own, leastways none he could acknowledge. His wife was barren, which is how he ended up making Sir Galen his heir." "Did he ever come back to England?" Henrietta frowned. "Only once, if I remember correctly. I believe he brought the child and his nurse back to Sir Maxwell after Beau Knightley's death." She fixed him with a hard glare. "And now not another word do you get out of me until you tell me what this is all about." But Sebastian simply gave her a resounding kiss on one powdered and rouged cheek and said, "Thank you, Aunt. Enjoy your visit with Lady Jersey." Chapter 54. The bell towers of the city were striking 4 when Sebastian watched Sir Galen Knightley tuck a silver-headed walking-stick up under one arm and pause to purchase a paper from one of the newsboys on St. James's Street. A dark, angry storm was sweeping in on the city, the air heavy with the scent of coming rain. "Walk with me away, if you will, Sir Galen," said Sebastian, stepping forward as the baronet turned toward the entrance to White's. The laugh lines beside the baronet's eyes creased as he seemed almost to wince at the suggestion he depart from his comfortable daily routine. "Well, I was just on my way to the reading-room," he said, his gaze drifting longingly toward his club's stately facade. "I know, I'm sorry. But I'd like your opinion on a tale I've just been told, and to be frank, I'd rather not repeat it where we might be overheard." Knightley hesitated, then shrugged. "As you wish." They walked down the hill toward the high, soot-stained brick walls of St. James's Palace and the Mall beyond it. Lightning flickered across the roiling underbelly of the clouds, and the air filled with dark, swirling flocks of birds coming in to roost. Sebastian said, "I had an interesting conversation this afternoon with the owner of a coffee shop frequented by Dr. Douglas Sterling. He tells me Sterling spent all of last year in Jamaica and returned only a few weeks ago." "Oh?" said Knightley. "I had no notion it was so recently." Sebastian studied the older man's hard-boned profile. "I think I know why both he and Stanley Preston were killed." Knightley glanced sideways at him. "Do you? Why is that?" "It all goes back to a deception carried out some 40 years ago." 40 years? Knightley gave a brittle, forced laugh. "You can't be serious." "I'm afraid I am. You see, 40-odd years ago, a certain Hertfordshire baronet shipped his young, excessively profligate heir off to a maternal uncle in Jamaica. The idea was to remove the heir from the influences of his boon companions, who, by all accounts, were a rather unsavoury lot. Only things didn't go quite according to plan." "They rarely do," observed Knightley, swinging his walking-stick back and forth. "True," said Sebastian. "It seems that shortly after his arrival in Jamaica, our young heir impregnated and was forced to marry the daughter of a prominent local landowner. Unfortunately, the young man barely lived long enough to see his son take his first steps before succumbing with his bride to a yellow fever epidemic." "Yes, I'm afraid Yellow Jack has long been a terrible scourge in the warmer American colonies. But is there a point to this tale?" "There is. You see, the father's death meant the orphaned babe was now the baronet's new heir. The grandfather wanted the child raised in England, and the uncle finally agreed to bring him." Knightley kept his gaze on the wind-tossed trees in the park beyond the palace, his jaw set hard, and said nothing. "The child had lost his wet nurse, along with his parents," said Sebastian, weaving together what he'd learned from Juba with what he'd been told by the Duchess of Claiborne, "and was being nursed by one of the uncle's own slaves, a pale-skinned quadroon named Callie, whose babe had died in the same epidemic. Callie was, by all accounts, a beautiful woman, so beautiful the uncle was rumoured to have made her his mistress. When the uncle and the child set sail for England, Callie came with them." Knightley pursed his lips in a way that sucked in his cheeks, his gaze fixed relentlessly straight ahead. "Now, here's where it gets interesting," said Sebastian. "Before he died, Douglas Sterling told Stanley Preston that he believed the real heir to the baronetcy had actually died in the epidemic along with his mother and father. That the child brought to England was, in fact, the child of the slave woman, Callie, and the uncle—" "It's a lie!" Nostrils flaring with the agitation of his breathing and both fists tightening on the handle of his walking-stick, Knightley drew up abruptly and swung to face Sebastian. "You hear me? It's all a lie!" Thunder rumbled long and ominously close as Sebastian studied the older man's rigid, angry face. "It may well be. But Dr. Douglas Sterling was a physician, which meant he was in a position to know if something irregular had occurred. I can't explain why he kept silent all these years. Perhaps he only suspected a switch had been made and was unable to prove it. But when he arrived back in London after a lengthy visit to his daughter, to find Stanley Preston anxious to marry his daughter to that very child, long since grown to manhood, and now in possession of a baronetcy to which he might actually have no real claim, I think Sterling decided to share his suspicions with Preston. Preston, of course, reacted to the tale with all the horror to be expected of a man obsessed with wealth and birth, not to mention a biblically inspired conviction in the superiority of the European race. It was you, after all, who told me of Preston's aversion to miscegenation. Remember?" Knightley fingered the catch on his walking-stick, a walking-stick that in all likelihood concealed a long, thin sword. Watching him carefully, Sebastian said, "That morning, shortly after the doctor left, Preston called a hackney and went to Fish Street Hill. That's where the old woman who'd once served as the child's nurse now lives, you see, in Bucket Lane. When the child's uncle returned to Jamaica, he left Callie behind to care for the boy. Only when the lad was just 3 years old, Sir Maxwell dismissed her. Sebastian paused. If the child truly was hers, the separation must have caused her unimaginable agony, although perhaps she consoled herself with the thought her son was growing up to the heir to a baronet. "It's not true," said Knightley, his features dark and twisted with rage. "You hear me? None of it is true." "I hope not," said Sebastian, "because if it is true, then when you killed the old woman Callie, you killed your own mother." The twin rows of Pall Mall's lampposts lent a golden cast to the strengthening rain. Knightley stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched tight. Sebastian said, "She denied it, you know. When Preston came to see her that day, Callie swore you were Bo Knightley's son, that it was her own child who died in the yellow fever epidemic. And after Preston left, when the daughter she'd had by a London costermonger questioned her, she still denied it. So perhaps it is nothing more than an old doctor's muddled suspicions. But 3 people are still dead because of it. 4, if you count the verger, Toop, who simply had the misfortune to be in the wrong place at the wrong time." The rain was falling harder now, large drops that pinged on the iron handrail beside them and ran down the baronet's hard, sun-darkened cheeks. "You're mad. Do you hear me? Utterly mad." Sebastian shook his head. "When he left Bucket Lane, Stanley Preston went to confront you, didn't he? I've no doubt you denied it all to him, just as you're denying it to me now. Why didn't you kill him then, I wonder? Did the conversation take place somewhere too public? Is that why you decided to wait and kill him later that night when he went to meet Rowan Toop at Bloody Bridge? You did know of that meeting, didn't you?" Knightley gave a harsh, ringing laugh. "Try telling this tale to the magistrates and see how far you get without any proof. You have none. You hear me? You have nothing." The laugh ended abruptly, his face twisting into something ugly as he brought up one hand to point a warning finger at Sebastian over the silver head of his sword-stick. "But you breathe one word of this nonsense in the clubs, one word, and I swear to God I'll call you out for it." Sebastian studied the other man's angry, pinched face, looking for some trace of the elegant bone structure that the old slave woman Callie had bequeathed to her daughter and grandson. But he could see only the slab-like Anglo-Saxon features of a typical Englishman. "You're right. I don't have any proof yet. But I will." And then he walked away, leaving the baronet staring after him, the silver-headed walking stick gripped tightly in his hands. "What precisely are you trying to do?" asked Hero later, staring at him. "Provoke Knightley into killing you?" Sebastian walked over to where a carafe of brandy stood warming beside the library fire. "I'm hoping he'll try. Because he's right. I can't prove he killed Preston. I can't prove he killed any of them. The only thing I can do is rattle him enough that he does something stupid. And if he should by some strange, inexplicable chance succeed in killing you—" He looked over at her with a crooked smile. "Then you'll know I was right." She made an inelegant noise deep in her throat, and rose from the library table where she'd been working on her article. "If you are right about Knightley, which at this point is still an if, then how do you explain Diggory Flynn?" Sebastian poured a measure of brandy into a glass and set aside the decanter. "I think Oliphant decided he needed to kill me as soon as he returned to London, and he hired Diggory Flynn to do the job." "Because he thought you intended to kill him?" "Yes." He went to stand at the library window, his brandy cradled in one hand as he stared out at the storm. "And if I had killed the bastard, Jamie Knox would still be alive today." A jagged sizzle of lightning lit up the nearly deserted wet street and silhouetted the dark rooftops of the opposite houses against the roiling underbelly of the storm clouds overhead. He could see a workman struggling to lash down the tools in his handcart, the lightning limning a pale, rain-washed face, cut by the strap of an eye patch as the old man squinted up at the sky. Then the flash subsided, leaving the scene in near-total darkness, and Sebastian realized the gusting wind must have blown out most of the oil lamps on the street. Hero said, "Oliphant should have known that's not your way." "I think you give me too much credit." "No." Light footsteps sounded in the hall, and Hero turned toward the door as Claire came in, carrying Simon. "Awake, little one," she said with a smile, "and not screaming yet." Sebastian watched her move to take the child into her arms, saw the toothless grin that spread across his son's face as she lifted him up. And he knew a jolting frisson of alarm as the significance of the workman's eye patch suddenly hit him. "Hero," he said, starting toward her, just as the window pane beside him shattered and a roll of thunder mingled with the crack of a rifle. Chapter 55. The globe of the oil lamp on the table near the door exploded in a shower of glass. "Get down!" shouted Sebastian, lunging toward Hero and Simon as he saw her fall. "Hero!" Crouching low, he caught her up in his arms, ran his hands over her, and felt the warm stickiness of blood. "Mother of God, you're hit! Where? Simon!" "We're all right," said Hero, her eyes dark and wide, the now screaming child cradled close. "It's just cuts from the flying glass." He looked over at the Frenchwoman, huddled behind a nearby chair. "Claire?" Claire's terrified gaze met his, and she nodded. He pushed up. "Stay here." "Tevlin!" he heard Hero shout as he tore across the entry hall and wrenched open the front door. A cold, wind-driven rain stung his face and whipped at the tails of his coat as he pelted down the wet front steps. He could see the aged workman pushing his cart toward Bond Street, head down against the storm, the wheels of the cart bouncing over the paving stones. Then he must have heard Sebastian's running footsteps, because he threw a quick glance over his shoulder. His hair had been liberally smeared with grey ashes, and the oddly lopsided grimace he'd once affected was gone, leaving him almost unrecognizable. "Flynn!" shouted Sebastian. The one-eyed man reached beneath his coat. Sebastian dove sideways behind the front steps of a house beside him as Diggory Flynn ripped off his eye patch and brought up a long-barreled pistol to fire. The shot ricocheted off the iron railing beside Sebastian's head, sparks showering the night. "You son of a bitch!" swore Sebastian, scrambling to his feet again. Flynn abandoned the workman's cart and took off, running. Sebastian tore after him. The former observing officer was both shorter and older, and Sebastian gained on him rapidly. Reaching out with his left hand, he grabbed Flynn's right shoulder and spun him around to drive his fist into the middle of the man's face, feeling bone and teeth give way in a blood-slicked crunch. "You bastard!" swore Sebastian. "You could have killed my wife and son." "You moved." Without losing his hold on the man's shoulder, Sebastian buried his fist in Flynn's gut, then caught him under the chin with a punishing right hook. Flynn's head snapped back, the force of the blow wrenching his coat from Sebastian's grasp. The man stumbled, tripped on the curbstone, and went down hard on his rump. Sebastian slipped his knife from his boot and advanced on him. "The same way you killed my brother." "Brother?" Flynn scrambled backward on his hands and buttocks, his face smeared with blood. "What brother?" His shoulder bumped against the area railing of the house behind him, and he reached to haul himself up. "Jamie Knox," said Sebastian, grabbing a fistful of the man's coat front and swinging him around to slam his back against the house wall. "But I—" Sebastian pressed the knife blade against his throat. Flynn's eyes widened and he swallowed hard, blood dripping off his chin from his broken nose and mouth. "Don't kill me." Sebastian shook his head, his lips curling away from his teeth. "Name one good reason why I shouldn't." Flynn's chest jerked on a ragged, quickly indrawn breath. "I can give you Oliphant." The French overture to Haydn's last piano sonata thundered with an energetic and passionate verve, as Sebastian threaded his way through Lady Farningham's crowded reception rooms. It was her second musical evening of the season, and it seemed that all of fashionable London had come to hear her latest Italian virtuoso. The more intent listeners were seated in the rows of gilded chairs drawn up before the pianoforte, but most of the guests circulated freely, drinking and eating and chatting in small clusters. Sinclair, Lord Oliphant, was standing beside one of the ornate pilasters in the drawing-room, his gaze fixed on the pianist, when Sebastian walked up behind his former colonel and said quietly, "I have Diggory Flynn. He's willing to testify that you paid him to kill Jamie Knox." Oliphant kept his eyes on the musician, not even bothering to turn his head as he said, "I never did any such thing." Lady Oliphant was too far away to hear their words, but she looked over at Sebastian and frowned pointedly. Sebastian kept his voice low. "True, you paid him to kill me, but Knox died. Diggory Flynn is scum. No one will believe him. Do you honestly think a jury would take the word of a smuggler against that of a peer of the realm?" "Perhaps. Perhaps not." Like Oliphant, Sebastian kept his attention seemingly focused on the performer. "The thing is, you see, your man shot at me tonight, with my wife and son standing beside me. Jarvis's daughter and grandson. The only reason I haven't already killed you is because they weren't hurt. But don't expect Jarvis to be swayed by such technicalities. You'll be lucky if you live long enough to stand trial." He watched as that perpetual, confident smile slid slowly from Oliphant's face. "I suppose you could try to run, but I don't think you'll get far." He bowed his head toward Oliphant's scowling wife. "My lady," he said, and turned to walk out of the room and out of the house. As he descended the front steps, he noticed one of the tall, dark-haired former hussar officers employed by Jarvis waiting across the rain-drenched street. For a moment, their gazes met. Then he heard Tom shout, "Governor! Oi, Governor!" He could see the tiger threading his way through the crowd of gawkers that always formed around such events. "Governor," said the boy, struggling to catch his breath as he skidded to a halt at the base of the steps. He held out a somewhat grubby calling card. "A lad just brung this from Bucket Lane." It was one of Sebastian's own cards. He flipped it over to see that someone had written on the back in a childish hand, "Please help. Juba." "I think it's a trap," said Tom. They were in a hackney headed toward Fish Street Hill. The rain had eased up for the moment, but water still dripped from the eaves of the mean houses and shops they passed, and a cold wind buffeted the old carriage. "Of course it's a trap," said Sebastian, his gaze on the soaring tower of the Church of St. Magnus that loomed over the bridgehead and Billingsgate Market. He'd expected Knightley to try to silence him, and he had worried about the safety of Juba and Banjo. What he hadn't foreseen was that the killer would use the woman and child to bait a trap for Sebastian. He wondered if life really spun in circles, or if it was simply some trick of the human mind that made people see patterns where none truly existed. The last time women and children had been put at risk because of him, he had failed to save them. He'd spent the last 3 years seeking some sort of redemption for that failure, and had found a measure of solace in his efforts on behalf of other victims of human evil. But now it was happening all over again. Tom shook his head. "So, why are you going there?" "Because if I don't, Juba and her son will die." Lit only by the occasional glimmer of a tallow candle showing through a grimy window, Bucket Lane lay dark and wet and deserted beneath the stormy sky. "What we gonna do?" whispered Tom, as they slipped down the lane to draw up in a shadowy doorway. Centuries old, Juba's house had only 2 stories, and was built so that the upper floor jutted out over the lower. It contained just 2 rooms per floor, with a different family living in each room. The front room of the upper story was dark. but the flickering, smoky light of a tallow candle showed through the thin, ragged curtain of the ground-floor room. "I want you to go inside, slowly count to 10, and then knock on the first door to your left. Just be certain to flatten yourself against the wall before you reach over to knock, and jerk your hand back quickly. I wouldn't put it past Knightley to shoot through the door rather than open it." "And then what?" "And then I want you to run into the street and keep running, no matter what happens."
"But, Governor—"
"You heard me." The boy hung his head.
"Aye, Governor."
Sebastian watched the tiger let himself in the house's battered street door and began to count. 1, 2. A single large shadow seated at the trestle table near the door showed through the worn cloth of the curtain. Knightley, probably, but if so, then where were Juba and Banjo? 3, 4. He told himself the woman and boy couldn't already be dead. Surely Knightley would leave them alive until he had Sebastian. 5, 6. Leaping up, Sebastian caught hold of one of the beams supporting the cantilevered upper story where it jutted out above the window. 7, 8. Kicking his legs, he began to swing back and forth, gathering momentum. 9, 10. He heard the tiger's knock, heard the sound of a bench being pushed back, saw the shadow rise to its feet. Then he kicked back hard with his legs and let go of the beam as he swung forward again toward the house. He crashed through the window feet first in a shower of broken glass and shattered framing. Coming down hard on his feet, he lost his balance and fell to his knees. He saw Juba crouched on the pallet near the hearth, her son clutched in her arms. Saw Knightley spin toward him, the barrel of a flintlock pistol wavering as he brought up his other hand to steady it. Sebastian threw himself sideways, jerked his own pistol free as he fell, and fired. In the confined space of the small room, the pistol's report was deafening, an explosion of smoke and flame and blood. Juba screamed. Knightley staggered back, slammed into the table, and crumpled slowly to the floor. The door from the hall burst open, and Tom catapulted into the room.
"Bloody hell, I told you to run!"
swore Sebastian. Tom drew up short, his eyes wide, his breath coming hard and fast. Swiping one sleeve across his nose, he edged closer to Knightley's now still body.
"Caw! You plugged him right through the eye, you did. Is he dead?"
Sebastian pushed to his feet, brushing broken glass from his clothes as he walked over to stare down at the baronet's slack face. "Yes." He bent to pick up the dead man's pistol, then went to hunker down beside Juba and Banjo, still pressed up against the corner by the hearth. "You both all right?" She nodded, her face slack, her pupils wide with terror.
"I didn't want to send you that note, but he said he'd kill Banjo if I didn't."
Sebastian shook his head. "Don't blame yourself. I'm the one who inadvertently put you at risk." She gazed beyond him to where Sir Galen Knightley lay sprawled, with one carefully manicured hand flung out, so that it lay curled against the worn paving stones of her house. She said, "Is he really my half-brother?" Sebastian shook his head. "I'm not sure we'll ever know." Chapter 56. Wednesday, the 31st of March.
"None of this can be allowed to get out naturally,"
said Jarvis, his hands clasped behind his back as he stood before the drawing-room's bowed front window. Jarvis seldom came to Brook Street, but he had arrived that morning shortly after dawn.
"Of course not,"
said Sebastian.
"Wouldn't do to have the lower orders start thinking us their equals in depravity and violence."
Jarvis glanced over at him.
"I take it you are being facetious."
He reached for his snuff-box.
"The morning papers will carry the shocking news that Sir Galen Knightley has fallen victim to footpads, whilst venturing unwisely into one of the more insalubrious areas of the city. A Bethnal Green navvy, who killed and dismembered his wife several days ago, has confessed to also murdering Stanley Preston and Dr. Douglas Sterling. Unfortunately, he has since succumbed to some sort of fatal seizure, so there will be no trial. Unfortunate for him, certainly, but no great loss to society from the sound of things.
More levity,
said Jarvis, lifting a pinch of snuff to one nostril. Sebastian smiled. Any luck yet finding King Charles's head? Jarvis inhaled so sharply he sneezed. Bless you, said Sebastian, as his father-in-law sneezed again and reached for his handkerchief. When is the Regent's formal opening of the vault to be? Jarvis glared at him over the folds of his handkerchief. Tomorrow. Not much time left. I take it you've no idea what's happened to it? Sorry. Jarvis tucked away his handkerchief. I assume my daughter and grandson are in the nursery? Yes. Hero tells me you encourage her in this barbaric nonsense of refusing to hire a wet nurse. I support her, yes, but the decision is hers and hers alone. What drivel! Jarvis turned toward the door. Then he paused to look back and say, Oh, by the way, Lord Oliphant has inexplicably disappeared. Speculation of an accident or foul play will likely appear in tomorrow's papers, but I'm told the body shouldn't surface for another 4 or 5 days, depending upon the weather. At that point it will be concluded he must have slipped and fallen into the river during Tuesday night's storm. And if he had succeeded in harming either my daughter or my grandson, you would be dead by now as well. The two men's gazes met and held. Then Jarvis nodded and walked out of the room. After the previous night's storm, the day had dawned clear and sunny, with the streets washed clean by the rain. Driving himself in his curricle, Sebastian curved along the southern edge of Hyde Park toward Knightsbridge and Handstown. His first stop was Sloane Street, where he found Miss Jane Austen walking in the gardens of Cadogan Square. She wore an old-fashioned round bonnet and her sensible brown pelisse, and her cheeks were ruddy with the cool, fresh air. "Lord Devlin," she said, when she saw him coming toward her. "You've read the news in this morning's papers?" "Yes." Her eyes narrowed as her intense gaze searched his face. "And none of it's true, is it?" "No." "I didn't think so. But that can only mean the killer was Knightley." "Why?" "Because he feared Preston and Sterling were in possession of information he was desperate to keep from becoming known." "And so he killed them, and cut off their heads in his rage? Who could have believed him capable of such viciousness?" "A wise woman once noted that it is difficult to know the true sentiments of a clever man." Her small dark eyes shone with amused delight. Then she shook her head. "Not so wise, given that I thought him another Colonel Brandon, staid, steadfast, and boring." "And how did Miss Preston receive this morning's news?" asked Sebastian, as they turned to walk along the garden path. "Do you know?" "I don't think she believes the reports in the newspapers either, but she is understandably relieved. She and Captain Wyeth plan to be wed as soon as possible, rather than wait for the passage of the customary 12 months of mourning." "Sensible. They've waited enough years already." Miss Austen glanced over at him. "I hear Lord Oliphant has disappeared." "So he has." "And you're not going to explain any of it to me, are you?" "No," he said, "but I'm confident in your ability to use your imagination." Continuing down Sloane Street toward Chelsea, Sebastian turned his curricle to run along the square, then drove into the lane that led toward Bloody Bridge. "What we doing here again?" said Tom. The chestnuts snorted and tried to shy as Sebastian guided them across the bridge and into the fields that stretched away on either side of the rutted road. "I have an idea." He drove through Market Gardens, fresh and green after the previous night's rain, toward the tower of the small country chapel that rose above the elms and hawthorns of its churchyard. The way he figured it, Rowan Toop must have come upon Preston's body not long after the killing, and, in his terror, accidentally dropped whatever satchel contained the king's head and coffin strap. The verger had obviously managed to retrieve the severed head, but he must have still been flailing about trying to find the coffin strap when he heard the approach of the young couple from the Rose and Crown. At that point he had abandoned his search and, with the king's head tucked under one arm, run in the only direction possible, across the bridge into 5 fields. Rattled by what he'd seen, and terrified of being caught in possession of relics plundered from the royal chapel, Toop's first instinct, surely, would have been to hide the item he'd hoped to sell to Stanley Preston. And where better to hide a dead man's head than in a churchyard? A small neoclassical structure, 5 Fields Chapel, was not old, having been built in the previous century, but its churchyard was already overflowing, for there never seemed to be enough room to bury London's endless supply of dead. After reining in beside the lich gate, Sebastian handed Tom the reins and dropped lightly to the ground. "I won't be long." Wandering paths overgrown with weeds and rampant ivy, past rusting iron fences and weathered headstones crusted with lichen, he found what he was looking for, not far from the road. A neglected, crumbling tomb, so old it was collapsing badly at one end. Crouching down beside it, Sebastian peered into the tomb's dank, musty interior. He could see decaying wood, and the dull gleam of weathered bone, and a canvas sack thrust hurriedly out of sight by a frightened man who hadn't lived long enough to retrieve it. He lifted the sack from its hiding place to find the cloth wet from the previous night's storm, and stained a nasty greenish red. Working carefully, he untied the thong fastening. Then he hesitated a moment before peeling back the canvas to reveal an ancient severed head, the skin of the eerily familiar oval face, dark and discoloured, the pointed beard still showing reddish-brown. But the hair at the back of the head was stained black by old dried blood, and cut short in anticipation of the executioner's blade. Thursday, 1st of April. "This is so exciting," said the Prince Regent, shivering with a combination of delicious anticipation and bone-numbing cold. He stood with Dean Legge, his brother, the Duke of Cumberland, and 2 boon companions in the newly constructed passage that led down to the royal vault beneath St. George's Chapel in Windsor Castle. "But are you quite certain I won't fit inside the vault itself?" Charles, Lord Jarvis, stood near the crude entrance to Henry VIII's small burial chamber. "I'm afraid not, Your Highness. The tomb is less than 5 feet in height, and only 7 by 9.5 feet wide. And with 3 burials, one of them extraordinarily large, there is barely enough room for Halford and the workman cutting an opening in the coffin's lid." "They should have thought to build a larger chamber," grumbled the prince. Then excitement overcame the minor bout of petulance, and he brought up his clasped hands to tuck them beneath his chin. "Oh, I do hope the body is complete." "I fear the chances of that are unfortunately slim, Your Highness," said Jarvis. "You must prepare yourself for the possibility that Charles's head was, in all likelihood, not buried with his body." He nodded to Sir Henry Halford, the President of the Royal College of Physicians, and a fawning sycophant who knew precisely where the real power in the realm lay. The labourer, well paid to keep the truth of that day's events to himself, stood back. "I do believe, said Halford, prolonging the suspense as he carefully separated the sticky folds of the coffin's cerecloth. "Yes." Eager to see, the prince thrust his head through the vault's entrance, his bloated body effectively blocking everyone else's view of the proceedings. "Is it there? Is the head there?" "It's here, Your Highness. Just look," said the physician, smiling in stunned triumph, as he held aloft the unexpectedly wet, dripping head of the long-dead king. They buried Jamie Knox on a misty evening in the elm-shaded medieval churchyard of St. Helen's, Bishopsgate, in the shadow of the moss-covered wall that backed onto the yard of the Black Devil. Afterward, Sebastian stood alone with Hero beside the stark, turned earth of the new grave, his hat in his hand and his head bowed. although he did not pray. He could hear the raucous call of a blackbird somewhere nearby, smell the pungent odour of damp loam and old stone. He said, "I've been thinking of making a trip up to Shropshire to take the mechanical Nightingale to Knox's grandmother." There was no need to state the other reason, perhaps the main reason, for his desire to visit the place of Knox's birth. Hero looked over at him, her eyes solemn and knowing, but all she said was, "I'm sure she would like that." He reached out to take her hand. "Will you come with me?" "If you want me to." "I want you," he said, his throat tight with emotion, as a gust of wind shuddered the trees overhead and sent a scattering of leaves spinning down to lie pale and shriveled against the cold, dark earth. Author's note. The discovery in early 1813 of the lost burial vault containing the coffins of Henry VIII, Jane Seymour, and Charles I was real and excited considerable popular attention. At the time, Byron wrote of the discovery, "Famed for contemptuous breach of sacred ties, by headless Charles, see heartless Henry lies," while Cruikshank produced a satire of the event called Meditations Amongst the Tombs. The caricature portrays the effeminate, unhappily married Prince Regent as envious of Henry VIII's success in ridding himself of so many wives, while Charles sits up in his coffin, holding his own detached head in silent warning. Cruikshank's cartoon considerably exaggerates both the size and the grandeur of the crude vault, which was indeed less than 5 feet high and 10 feet wide. My description of the burial vault and the formal opening of Charles I's coffin comes largely from the account written by Sir Henry Halford, one of the Regent's personal physicians, who was present for the opening and was responsible for the removal of several items, including a piece of the severed vertebrae and a tooth. When these items were returned to the vault in 1888, a still extant watercolour sketch was made that shows the interior of the tomb and the disposition of the coffins. That watercolour can now be found online. There is some dispute as to the wording of the inscription on Charles's coffin strap. Sir Henry Halford reports that the lead strap was inscribed with the words King Charles, 1648. Later writers, including Guizot, who wrote A History of the English Revolution in 1838, claim the strap read Charles Rex, 1648. Another 19th century writer named Sanderson claims it read Charles, King of England. Clarendon Fuller said it was a plate of silver, not a lead strap, and was inscribed King Charles I, while John Ashton goes with Halford's version, King Charles, 1648. Since Halford was there and wrote his account shortly after viewing the coffin, I have used him as my authority. For the execution and burial of Charles I, see Memoirs of the Last 2 Years of the Reign of King Charles I, written by Sir Thomas Herbert, who was present at the hurried burial of the executed king. Although his account, plus a letter written by Herbert to Sir William Dugdale in 1681, which also detailed the burial of the king, were in existence in 1813, both were forgotten, and the location of Charles I's body was considered a mystery. Although I have omitted it to avoid confusion, there was actually a 4th burial found in the vault. A small mahogany coffin covered with crimson velvet and containing the stillborn child of Queen Anne was found resting atop Charles's coffin, which tells us that at the time of Queen Anne, the exact location of Charles I's body was known. The description of what happened to the remains of Edward IV, when his tomb was discovered in St. George's Chapel in 1789, is based on fact. Even Horace Walpole bragged about having managed to snag a lock of the king's hair. For the colourful history of Oliver Cromwell's head, see Beale's The Posthumous History of Oliver Cromwell's Head, and Howard, The Embalmed Head of Oliver Cromwell. Cromwell's head was recently reburied. The fate of the rest of his body is unknown. For the history of Henri IV's head, see Gabet and Charlier. L'énigme du roi sans tête. Henri IV was originally buried at Saint-Denis, but his head was reputedly stolen in 1793, when the revolutionaries broke into the royal tombs and tossed the Bourbons' bones into a common grave. When that grave was opened in 1817, Henri IV's head was indeed found to be missing. Forensic reconstruction of a head currently held in a Parisian bank, and long believed to be the one taken from the grave, confirmed that it belonged to Henri. Recent DNA testing on the same head cast doubt on that authentication, as its DNA reportedly did not match that of a living Bourbon who provided a sample. However, the paternity of a number of Bourbons has always been cloudy, and the accuracy of the test is also in dispute. Henry Addington, 1st Viscount Sidmouth, was a former Prime Minister and Home Secretary in 1813. His father was indeed a simple physician, although of course he had no cousin named Stanley Preston. The Irish Dullahan is essentially an embodiment of death, and is most likely derived from some forgotten ancient god placated with human sacrifices, in which the victims were decapitated. Lord Mansfield's famous decision in the 1772 Somerset case is generally considered to have essentially ended chattel slavery in England and Wales, although emancipation came gradually enough that advertisements for runaway slaves were still occasionally seen into the late 1780s. The decision did not apply to Scotland, where colliers and salters were still held in conditions of slavery until 1799. Although Britain abolished the slave trade in 1807, slavery still flourished in its colonies, and there was little opprobrium attached to those, such as Sir Galen Knightley and Stanley Preston, who owned slaves. The wealthy family in Jane Austen's Mansfield Park owned plantations worked by slaves. The number of works written about Jane Austen is staggering. For my portrayal of Austen, I have relied, among others, on Le Fay's A Chronology of Jane Austen and Her Family, Burns' The Real Jane Austen, A Life in Small Things, Honan's Jane Austen, Her Life, and of course Austen's own letters and novels. The biographical information given for Jane Austen's brother Henry and her cousin and sister-in-law Eliza is largely taken from those works. Eliza Austen died of breast cancer on the 25th of April, 1813. There really was a bloody bridge that spanned the small rivulet running along 5 fields. There was an ancient tavern in the area called the Monster, a corruption of the monastery, but it was not precisely where I've placed it. The 20th Light Hussars served in both Jamaica and the Peninsula, although not precisely in the years I have used here. Basil Thistlewood's coffee house in Cheney Walk is patterned on the very real Curiosity Shop in Chelsea, owned by a man who called himself Don Salerno. While today we tend to think of butter as a luxury item, the poor of London actually ate a great deal of bread and butter. The fat it provided was an important part of what kept them alive. Hero's articles on the poor of London are inspired by a similar work carried out several decades later by Henry Mayhew, and Mayhew is the source for Hero's interviews with the various costermongers. The end. This is Davina Porter. We hope you have enjoyed this production of Who Buries the Dead?, a Sebastian Sincere mystery by C.S. Harris. Recorded Books offers a wide selection of bestsellers, mysteries, classics, histories, and more. So look for us at your public library or on download sites online. And thank you for being a Recorded Books reader.